Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third meeting in 2014 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I remind all members, please, to either turn off or at least turn to silent all mobile phones and other electronic devices so they don't interfere with the committee's work. We have apologies this morning from three members, Dennis Robertson, Marco Biaggi and Margaret McDougall, and we're joined by two substitutes, Jenny Mara and Joan McAlpin. Welcome. And we'll be joined later by John Pentland as an additional member for the third panel. Item 1 on the agenda, I would ask if the committee are content that we take item 3, consideration of the evidence in private later. Content. Is that great? Thank you. Okay, item 2 is consideration of the draft third National Planning Framework, NPF 3, and review of Scottish Planning Policy, SPP. We have three panels of witnesses this morning. I'd like to welcome our first panel of witnesses. We are joined by Ken Cronin, who's the Chief Executive Officer of United Kingdom Onshore Operators Group, David Bell, who's Director of Jones Lang LaSalle, here representing SSE, Joss Blaymire, who's here representing Scottish Renewables, and Brian Galloway, who's the Energy Policy Director at Scottish Power. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. I think we've agreed we'll just dispense with opening statements and go straight into questions. I would just stress we are a little bit short on time this morning. We've got three panels to get through before lunchtime, so we'll need to try and focus as quickly as we can on the issues. I would ask members, if they can, to address questions to a particular witness rather than throw them open to general discussion. Otherwise, you'll all want to answer every question that's asked, and we'll be here all day. So members could direct their questions, and then if you want to come in and answer a question directed to somebody else, if you just catch my eye, I'll try and bring you in as time allows. And I'd ask members if they would please to be as short and as focused on their questions as they can, and similarly, if we could have short and focused responses, that would be very helpful. Having said all that, I want to start off with a generic question to all of you, just to give you the opportunity to set out in broad terms and hopefully rather briefly your general views on NPF 3, given the committee's focus is around the energy section and provisions on energy. I want to ask you all, maybe start with Mr. Cronin, are you satisfied with the approach being taken in NPF 3? Do you think it's going to be helpful to the development of your industry, and particularly when it comes on to SSE, Scottish Power, and Scottish Renewables? I'd like to hear from you about the proposals on wild land and the other issues around separation distances around wind farms. So get a general view on that, and then other members will want to come in and follow that up in more detail. But perhaps we can start with Mr. Cronin, and we'll just work our way along.
Good morning. I think in general my view, or our view from the industry, is that the document is fine but a bit light in consideration of unconventional oil and gas, coal bed methane and shale. I think there needs to be a lot more direction from the Scottish Government in terms of policy in this area. With the specific issue around separation distances, a fixed separation distance for our industry doesn't work. We work on the basis of scientific evidence and fact, site by site. And we work very closely with SEPA, the HSC, DEC and local authorities around the geography, the geology, the topography, which is different in each site. We do have buffer zones that are agreed with SEPA and other regulators as a part of that process, but it's very much site by site depending on those issues.
Thank you. Mr. Bell?
Firstly, I'd just say that SSE welcomes the opportunity to give evidence to the committee. In terms of wildland, as a general quick response on that, there's obviously a lot of detail in the submission, but some of the absolutely key points would be it's clearly a material consideration for development management. The government's been very clear in saying that wildland would not be a designation. I think caution has to be taken with the SNH mapping at the present time, and there's been a large number of technical responses on the mapping. questioning its robustness. So I think the mapping can be helpful, but we need to be careful that it's not decisions are not based on it, but it rather informs decisions. I think also the SPP policy, which we've yet to see in its final form, which will come out in July, should not set the bar unattainably high, and it should have an appropriate policy test that industry can follow, and indeed planners around the country can follow. And I think that the last quick point I would make on the wildland matter is that, taken together with some of the other policy provisions, it may mean that there is a real risk that some of the very challenging targets that remain for the UK and for the Scottish Government in terms of renewable energy generation could potentially be at risk. If I can give a quick point on the 2.5 kilometre matter, it's certainly my and SSE's view that there is no evidential basis at the present time to show that there's a problem with the current 2 kilometre setback for the identification of areas of search. So, in short, there seems to be no justification to move to 2.5 kilometres. And the last point I would make is that it's very important that if the 2 kilometre setback distance is enshrined in SPP for areas of search, it's most important that the caveat remains that individual planning applications will be assessed on their respective merits, because up and down the UK there are many turbines or wind farms that are closer than 2.5 kilometres to settlements and are working acceptably with local communities. And certainly the coalition government has not gone down the route of setting a fixed setback distance. They've rejected that.
Okay, thank you. Just Blair.
Thanks also for the opportunity to give evidence today on behalf of Scottish Renewables. We support the tone of the MPF3 in a lot of instances, and its support for the need for us to reach our renewable energy targets, and also support the need to protect some of our most valued landscapes. In particular, within the MPF3, it's noted that NSAs and national parks will be offered a high degree of protection. We support that. However, we also recognise that the planning system needs to be balanced and needs to allow well-sited and responsible developments to come forward, especially developments which are providing sustainable growth to Scotland, and onshore wind is one such technology which is already delivering that growth. And therefore we're particularly concerned that MPF3 and SPP, which we've currently seen in its draft form, present a risk that these projects won't be judged on their own merits, and they'll be judged rather in a one-size-fits-all policy. And that particularly relates to wildland and to separation distances.
Thank you. Mr Galloway.
Thank you, Convener. I think we would welcome the National Planning Framework 3 and in particular the strong emphasis on energy infrastructure. I think we all agree Scotland enjoys a great opportunity in terms of energy investment. First thing I'd say, I think, is that we very much view ourselves as a responsible developer. We engage fully with our stakeholders and very much work in partnership with the consultees to the planning process, and I think that's borne through our sort of excellent track record in delivering projects through the planning system and just in general how we do business. On the specific issues around wildland and separation distance, I would echo what some of the other panel members have said. I mean, we definitely agree there is wild land, and we take account of it already at the environmental impact assessment stage. We think that the existing designations around, for example, Nature 2000, birds and habitats, and some of the other sort of designations already cover everything we need in this area. As David said, we sort of share some concerns around the sort of SNH mapping exercise, and I think we'll probably get into that as we go through this session. Separation distance, I think, again, we worry that it could severely constrain future development of onshore wind, and that's likely to create difficulty in achieving longer-term renewable and climate change targets.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, and thank you also for keeping your answers short. It's much appreciated. Just before I bring in Chick Brodie, who wants to follow up some of these points, I've got one follow-up particularly to Mr Galloway and Mr Bell, because you both mentioned this threat to meeting the targets. The information we got from the Scottish Parliament's Information Centre was that to meet the target we'll need 16 gigawatts of renewable output. I think that's the figure from Scottish Renewables. According to Scottish Renewables, there's 20.5 gigawatts currently either consented, constructed, in planning or in scoping. Doesn't sound like there's a big risk there to us meeting the targets, even with these variations being put in place.
Convener, if I could respond on that, I think the Scottish Government issued just on the 19th of December the route map update, which sets out a very accurate update of current deployment. And what that tells us is, you're right, there's the 16 gigawatt, which is the equivalent of the 100% by 2020. But what it identifies is that if you look at installed capacity that is operational and consented but not yet built, it totals about 11.1 gigawatts. So there remains a shortfall of 4.9 or so gigawatts to attain the 16% figure. Now, it has to be remembered that not everything that is consented will be built for various reasons. So there does remain, in a relatively short space of time to 2020, a significant shortfall against that 16 gigawatt target. And it has to also be remembered, I think, that the UK legal obligation for 2020 is 15% of all energy to come from renewable sources, which is referenced in the route map. Scotland clearly contributes to that. The current position is 4.1% of UK energy from renewable sources. So insofar as Scotland contributes to the UK position, there's still an awful lot to be done, I would say. So the factual position, as I see it, is that there is a shortfall against that target.
Mr Galloway, do you want to add anything?
Only that it's a sort of, when we're looking at this, it's the sort of cumulative impacts of the various sort of policy initiatives. I mean, there's obviously constraints around suitability of wind resource and finding the best sites. There are grid constraints, as we know, in many areas. And when you layer on top of that the increased restrictions around the wildland designation and the separation distance, when you do a sort of layering over in terms of the remaining land mass available for development, it really is very restricted indeed, and it's unlikely that there would be sufficient projects to meet those targets in our view.
Okay. Briefly, Mr Miller.
One very brief point, just adding what Brian has said. I think if you also add in cumulative pressures that are arising in some areas where there are already a number of wind farms there, so it may be the case that the cumulative capacity means no more can come forward in certain areas. There's also Eskdale-Muir, the seismic monitoring station, which is constraining a number of developments coming forward in the south of Scotland, and there remains aviation constraints in some areas. So if you add that to the 2.5 kilometre plus wild land, you can see that actually the deployable areas may be severely constrained.
Good morning, gentlemen. It was interesting hearing Mr Bell's comment in view of Colin Flint's assertions this morning about investment in renewables in Scotland. I wonder if I may firstly ask you about the mapping exercise by SNH. I think in the Scottish Power submission, the view was that the SNH mapping exercise was perhaps not as effective, perhaps not even fit for purpose as we would have wished, which gives us some concern, because in previous sessions we've discussed this and asked questions of SNH in terms of the delay of the mapping exercise. Now that we have one, apparently you're dissatisfied with it. Is that right?
Yes. There's a detailed technical response which SSE has submitted to SNH. My understanding is that SNH has received over 400 responses to its consultation that was closed in December. The technical advisors to SSE on landscape matters have carefully reviewed the SNH mapping exercise and have some serious concerns on its robustness. That's not to say a mapping exercise will not be useful for development management, But if it is to be used, it has to be, in my view, robust, and it has to have an appropriate methodology that can be supported by industry and by regulators. And I think also SNH make it very clear in their consultation paper that was issued in November last year that it is not yet based on field work, which is very surprising. And I think it's essential that if there is to be a mapping exercise that's relied upon for development management activity, that is based on field work and that everybody can have confidence in it, because at the present time that confidence is not there. That is why there is a reluctance to fully support it in its present form.
I find that extremely disturbing in view of the evidence that we've had before, and perhaps it's something we can revisit in terms of evidence we've had. I wonder if Mr. Galloway would like to comment on the question I raised.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we agree that there are some methodological shortcomings in the analysis. I think there's 4 points in particular we would highlight. Firstly, that there's no real differentiation about the extent of wildness. It's a sort of binary black or white assessment, and clearly conditions will vary significantly. So ideally we would have seen some more sort of differentiation in the definition. As David says, some of the assumptions we believe have not yet been sufficiently rigorously tested. They're also to some extent based on a perception of perceived naturalness, which is by its very nature subjective. And for developers like us, it would be prohibitively expensive to independently test the data. So that's where we're coming from. I think, as David said, other people have shared that view, including respected commentators like the Crofton Commission, and so we think there's room for improvement there.
Oh, no,
I think just Mr. Blamire wants to come in. So,
well, I was going to ask a question. Perhaps Mr. Bell can answer this. I mean, one of the issues that we tussled with was the definition of wild land. I mean, do you have a clear idea in your mind as to what wild land actually is?
well, maybe let Mr. Blamire answer the previous question first, because it caught my eye first, and then we'll bring Mr. Bell in to answer that.
Sorry,
I think it does relate to that point. It's important to know that we've had a map of wild land since 2002. However, what that wild land map is termed as search areas for wild land. So it's areas of Scotland which there's a possibility they may have, an area which needs to be protected due to its wilderness. But the important point is the current SNH map updates that map, but it's the use of that map which, as is worded in NPF and SPP at the moment, is dangerous, we think. So it's using the assumption that all those areas are possibly constrained, rather than highlighting areas which may be wild and allowing developers to perform on-the-ground assessments. So what you have at the moment, and the potential to have, is a desk-based study done from a remote location to judge characteristics of land on the ground, and we don't think that's appropriate.
Yes, just to answer the question that was posed, I think what is wild land? Well, some of the key points would be it's subjective, but undoubtedly there is a way of identifying wild land characteristics. I think that's fair to acknowledge, but I think, as was said, these characteristics are variable, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of areas on a map. And I think that is where the danger lies, in that the government has said it does not wish to put forward a designation, but if a line is put on a map, there are extensive areas of Scotland, then it does not only become a potential constraint for onshore wind, but it becomes a constraint for other types of development, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, that may be pursued in years to come for economic development purposes. But I think the way forward on that, and a positive suggestion, picking up on Joss's point, is that what SSE progresses for each of its developments that may have an effect on wildland is a wildland assessment. And one of the suggestions for SPP would be a mandatory requirement for developments that are close to or within wildland to produce a wildland assessment that would properly look at the effect a development may have on wildland characteristics, and that would be based importantly on field work. And that is the element that, as I said earlier, is lacking from the current SNH exercise.
Yeah, it's just to follow up on that, because I think it's important that we make the point that these wildland considerations happen routinely in any case, even though the concept is quite difficult to define through the environmental impact assessment process. There's already rigorous assessment in areas around landscape and visual and biodiversity, and I think that delivers the right answer in terms of the planning decision 99 times out of 100. So it's already there. We don't need a new sort of quasi-definition of wildland to make sure we do this work. It already happens routinely.
One question. If I may ask on the issue of separation, to comment why you think the definition of the area of separation has been changed in terms of the distance between areas of search and settlements from 2 kilometres to 2.5 kilometres, and what you think the impact would be on renewables. And associated with that question is, and I think Mr. Bell used the phrase "one size fits all." Of course, that doesn't apply in every application. I just wonder, in those circumstances where, in fact, you haven't even met the 2 kilometre criterion, how have you managed to take communities with you in these circumstances?
I think, firstly, it's in my experience, I practice throughout the whole of the UK, so I'm involved in wind energy projects, often in England, where there's a greater density of population, and it's often the case that wind farms are sited in proximity to settlements, and that could be 900 metres, it could be 1,500 metres away from them. Now, the approach is based on early engagement and consultation with communities, but of course you cannot always bring everybody with you all of the time. But development management practice has progressed on the basis of treating every scheme on its merits, and often it's the case that acceptable effects will be found at distance of 800 or 900 metres from settlements. But depending on matters such as the topography, the amount of ground cover, the format of settlements and so on. So that practice is working well. And I think the important distinction is for areas of search identification for spatial frameworks, the 2 kilometre distance is working well. And in Scotland, practice is that if applications are coming in closer than 2 kilometres, then a reporter or a planning officer will judge that application on its respective merits. It may get refused or it may get approved. But the important point is the 2 kilometre distance or the 2.5 kilometre distance is not an absolute boundary. It's simply a guide for areas of search, and that is the myth that I see perpetuated throughout the UK, is that Scotland has a 2 kilometre setback requirement, and that is clearly not the case, and it often gets misinterpreted as that. So that is really why I'm putting an emphasis on it.
Just to reinforce that point, I think, I think you know, but we feel the existing sort of 2 kilometre guide is adequate and proportionate. But some of our biggest sites in Scotland, sites like Blacklaw and even Whiteley, breach that 2 kilometre threshold at the moment. So under these sort of arrangements, projects like that we consider almost the sort of gold standard of sort of planning and developing, they wouldn't necessarily fit the 2 kilometre criteria, let alone the 2.5 kilometres.
Yes, Mr. Blammer.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So again, the origin of the 2 kilometre separation distance has always been a guide and not a boundary, as David pointed out. And the Scottish Government actually commissioned Dundee University to look into the origin of that figure, and the conclusion was that they weren't able to trace the origin of the 2 kilometre separation criterion used in Scotland definitively to any study, and they found no supporting data to justify this distance. Now, that's not to say the distance is wrong in terms of how it's used at the moment. It's a guide, and development may be able to take place within that 2 kilometres if the landscape and visual assessment shows it can. And in the same instance, it may not be able to take place outside the 2 kilometre separation distance if it's shown to have too great an impact. So it's there as a guide, and it's important it continues to be used as a guide rather than introducing this one-size-fits-all approach.
Thank you.
Still on wildland, I think Joe McAlpin, you've got a question.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of quick supplementaries on wildland. One of the reasons historically that Scotland does have a higher rate of renewable energy is because of some of the marvellous hydro developments that went ahead in the last century. Do you think if this wildland designation had been in place back in the days of Tom Johnson, would we have had any of these hydro developments? I know it applies to wind, but if you couldn't build in wildland, do you think we would have had any of these things?
I think it's a very good point. The answer may be not. We just don't know. But I think one point that is worth noting on that is that many of these hydro developments are not reversible. They're there essentially in perpetuity now. They're part of Scotland's infrastructure, and many would say they fit in well with the landscape. Others will have a different view, but I think the important thing to remember about wind farms is that they are all time limited by their nature. So they are only there for 25 years. Now, in the National Planning Policy in England, in NPS EN3, there is a specific reference to the reversibility of wind farms. So my view would be that if a wind farm is consented in a landscape, whether it's close to wildland or not, that landscape is revealed in its previous form 25 years hence. It's in National Planning Policy in England, and it's recorded as an important consideration for decision makers. So if it's important, it should be afforded weight. And part of SSE's representation to SPP has been for an explicit recognition of the reversible nature of wind farms. And I think that is an important consideration that should be brought to mind in the consideration of the wildland matter.
Yeah, I would echo those comments and say the industry has worked closely with Scottish Natural Heritage to start to develop good practice guidance for decommissioning and restoration of land. So that work is already well underway. And I suppose, relating to your question about hydro developments, there's areas of rural communities in Scotland who are very concerned by the wild mapping process. The Crofton community, for one, landowners. I noted in Scottish Land and Estates, they were concerned about the definition of wild, when a lot of people work and use this land quite regularly, and it's used for economic activity. So we're in danger of putting up a barrier which shouldn't be in place.
If I could just have one more quick supplementary on that. Although the wildland designation is applying to wind farms, do you fear that it may be interpreted by some people to stop other forms of development, like, for example, the enhanced high-voltage energy transmission network? I know that some of your companies are putting a huge investment into that. I mean, if that was going through an area of wild land, could you see an issue where it might be used to try to stop that essential work going ahead?
I think wildland is a characteristic that is already taken into account in routing decisions, whether it's for transmission or distribution. And if there are extensive areas of wildland identified, and hopefully it would not be as a designation as the government has expressed, but it would be a factor that would be prominent in routing decisions. So it could not be ruled out that it may not be a major constraint in the future.
Thanks.
Right, I think we probably need to move on, unless Alison, you're desperate to ask about wildland. A couple of very brief follow-ups, if I could. Just so I'm clear, maybe Mr. Bell and Mr. Galloway in particular, I mean, what you're saying is I think what you're saying is you're not against protecting wildland in itself, but you're just uncomfortable with the exercise that's been undertaken by SNH. Is that fair? Yes,
I think if I was summarising, I would say there's two key points. One is the concern over the mapping exercise, which we've made a detailed technical response on. And secondly, how wildland features in the spatial framework methodology within SPP. It's currently within Group 2. Our view is it would sit more appropriately within Group 3. And allied to that, the policy test in the wording in SPP should not set the bar unattainably high. It should provide an appropriate development management framework policy which allows for individual applications to be assessed on their respective merits, but accepting that wildland is a resource that requires a degree of protection in development management decisions.
Mr Galloway?
Yeah, I would agree with that. We don't need a quasi-designation. We already operate in many of the areas highlighted with no adverse effects.
One last question. Seeing as you mentioned, Mr Bell, you mentioned restoration and decommissioning, how is the wind industry going to avoid the situation that's happened with open cast coal mining, where we're left with a huge bill potentially to the taxpayer because all the bonds that are supposed to be put in place, it turns out, don't exist?
Yes. Well, I think there's no evidence at the present time that there is a legacy of undecommissioned projects in the UK.
Well, obviously, because none of them will have reached 25 years.
Yes, some of them are nearing that. You're right, that is a key point. But there's obviously repowering of some schemes is going ahead. But the use of bonds is important, and whether that's also allied to legal agreements, Section 75 agreements, it may be the case that there requires to be a more robust approach to that, with the warning signs that we've had from open cast coal. But the magnitude of restoration is somewhat less than major land engineering. We're dealing with access tracks, and we're dealing with dismantling the towers and so on. So the magnitude is different. There is a mechanism to put in place more confidence that there will be the resources to deal with that in the future.
All right, thank you. I think we probably need to move on then, because there's other issues we need to cover. I think Alison Johnson, you wanted to ask about energy storage.
Yes, energy storage is obviously important for energy security, for protection from peak prices. Obviously, investing in it would be very good for the economy too. Scottish renewables in particular, I think, highlight challenges sort of surrounding forthcoming changes to market arrangements through EMR. I just wonder if you are hopeful that this can be overcome and that we will start to see the developments that we need.
I think at the moment, as with all renewables technologies and pump storage, which isn't strictly a renewables technology, there's a lot of uncertainty still remaining with the end of the EMR process this year. And whether pump storage is supported through that mechanism and through the current energy bill or through a different mechanism, we're yet to understand. So there's a bit of a gap in knowledge at the moment, and that's something we'd welcome discussion with UK and Scottish governments around how pump storage may be supported, considering its significant benefits it can bring to the Scottish economy and also to the efficiency of our renewables generation mix.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, but pump storage has a number of sort of policy and market design type questions that it needs to consider. Scotland, for example, has under the current locational transmission charging arrangements, any such projects in the north would suffer a cost disadvantage. So that needs to be taken into account in the economic assessment. EMR, the electricity market reform, is really positive, and pump storage projects should qualify for the capacity payment that's being considered to help ensure there's enough generation at times of peak demand and system stress. But by its very nature, that capacity payment will take away some of the investment case for pump storage, because one of the sort of key attributes is that it benefits from peak electricity prices, and that's when pump storage projects are economic. But the capacity payment will rightly smooth and eliminate many of these peak prices. So on one hand it receives a capacity payment, and on the other it loses some of its energy market revenue. So there needs to be a way to sort of solve that intractable problem. I mean, I think we obviously need to have enough energy in terms of megawatt hours on the system, and the investments we're seeing on all the technologies should bring that. You need to have enough capacity on the system, and the EMR capacity mechanism should deliver that. But you also need enough flexibility on the system, and I think there's no market mechanism that exists to reward that flexibility at the moment, and I think that's something that institutions like National Grid understand and are trying to think about in terms of future market design. So you need energy, you need capacity, and you need flexibility.
Yes.
Just briefly add from SSE's perspective that SSE welcomes the inclusion of the pump storage elements within NPF3, and I think it will clearly give greater flexibility to National Grid to balance supply and demand. And I think talking about targets earlier, as more intermittency is coming into the system, there's more non-dispatchable load, it becomes much more effective at balancing out that supply and demand. So SSE welcomes the full inclusion in NPF3.
NPF3, the location given for pumped hydroelectric storage is throughout Scotland. Do you think that just reflects, there aren't any specific locations mentioned there, and there may be, but do you think that's just indicative of the fact that decisions yet have to be made, and that offers an element of flexibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's about keeping options open. I think I would agree with what David says, that there is a big potential opportunity here in terms of pump storage investment and jobs in the sector. There is definitely potential from existing sites in terms of availability of infrastructure. I mean, our generation facilities in this area are very reliable and flexible. They've got very high availability when called on by the system operator, and they provide a very fast response time. So I think there's a role for existing sites. There is potential for new development, and the fact that we just don't know the environmental and technical details of all of that suggests that it's about keeping options open at this stage.
That's me with energy storage. I would like to ask questions on buffer zones, but presume we'll be coming to that.
Well, I don't. Christian Aller, were you going to follow up a question on energy storage?
I was going to ask, was the question
the same questions, right? Well, if anybody else wants to ask about energy storage, otherwise I'm happy just to move on. Yeah.
Thank you. We're obviously hearing that, according to the written submissions, you might feel that, open cast coal mine buffer zones are 500 metres. With wind farms now, we're looking at 2.5 kilometres. And there's a suggestion from Scottish Environment Link that unconventional gas would be a 2 kilometre buffer zone. And it seems quite arbitrary that it's okay to live 500 metres from a coal mine, but further from a site of unconventional gas extraction. And Mr. Cronin, when you were speaking at first, you suggested that one size would never fit all, that a sort of set buffer zone wouldn't work in your industry, and that we should be looking at the geographical lie of the land. How small a buffer zone might you have? How close to a domestic property would it be possible to extract unconventional gas from?
It's a very good question. I think, first of all, where is unconventional and conventional gas extracted at the moment? We have sites in RSPB nature reserves, we have sites in SSSI sites, we have sites very, very close to council estates. So it's a real mixture. And each site is looked at on its merits in terms of watercourses, the aquifers, the noise, light pollution, etc. And the reality is that there isn't one size fits all. We have sites in the UK that are as close as 500 metres to homes, and we have sites further away. It really does depend on the site location, the site geology and the topography.
I think, just adding to that, I think there is a real problem that the planning system has if there's a non-flexible approach to buffer zones. And in practice, with regard to wind farms, the approach certainly south of the border that's followed, which I think has some resonance up here and some relevance, is that decision makers posed the question, would the proposal affect the outlook of residents to such an extent that it would be so unpleasant and oppressive that this would become an unattractive place in which to live? And that revolves around essentially recognising that a view from a property is a private interest, but there's a public interest in not creating living conditions that would be unattractive. And I think that's when it then comes down to individual projects to then judge what is the effect of this project on the property or the settlement, and for planners to do that in the field and relative to individual projects. Because you may well find, as I said earlier, that you've got a project that sits comfortably a kilometre away from a village, and that local people are supportive of it. Whereas if you had a 2-kilometre setback requirement, you might say, well, actually, we can't develop there. So that is why I think there's a real danger in using a buffer zone as a fixed limit, and hence why I emphasise the point that applications really need to be considered on their merits.
Just to add to that as well, I would say that, you know, regardless of the technology, whether you're talking about unconventional gas or wind farms, despite being, you know, such different technologies, the important point to note is that when you create a buffer zone, you create a boundary line, and it can almost result in a yes/no decision based on that line without taking into account anyone's experiences around the area or any environmental experiences as well. So it's important to note the industries, as well as asking for flexibility and the ability to judge projects on their own merits, we're not asking for a green light beyond any buffer as well. And I'm sure individual communities would be concerned if that was the case, but it's not something we're asking for.
Just finally, I mean, our view is that it works well at the moment on a case-by-case basis. We absolutely engage communities early in the planning process and take their views into account. And I can give examples where we've absolutely changed plans around the wind farm site and turbine placement based on that community feedback. So in our experience, it works well.
Convener, I don't know if you're aware, there was a community bid for a turbine in Edinburgh at Portobello. The group were called Pedal, and they could potentially have had a turbine quite close to urban settlement. Do you think we need to look at this differently when we're not looking at wind farms, but, you know, specific community projects that may just involve one turbine?
In terms of a setback distance relating to spatial frameworks, I think the position would be that if there is the current position, that works well, and that still allows for individual turbines rather than wind farms to be considered. And in those types of situation, I would say it's still the same approach. Would the amenity of a property be unacceptably affected, taking it into account visual considerations, shadow flicker and noise? If these matters can be satisfactorily addressed, then the development should go ahead. That is essentially the planning system operating effectively. So I would say it's very similar issues that are raised by developments, whether it's 3 turbines or 1, albeit the magnitude of visual effect is different, but it's the same considerations, I would say.
That also doesn't, a buffer zone or any kind of set distance also doesn't take into account innovation. And I know there are a number of onshore wind developers and manufacturers looking at technologies which would be far more suitable in urban environments. So to simply rule out an area in a one-size-fits-all policy doesn't allow for technology to develop and doesn't allow for innovation, which the current planning system currently does.
I'll ask a follow-up on this question of buffer zones to Mr. Cronin about unconventional gas. There are large parts of central Scotland, including large parts of Fife, which I represent, which were built up around the coal mining industry, and you've got settlements built around what were old pit heads. I mean, what's the impact of a unconventional gas extraction on the amenity of a neighbourhood compared to, say, a traditional deep mine and with all its pit head machinery and impacts and so on? I mean, what's the sort of comparison in terms of impact?
I think the biggest impact is during the first phase, which is the drilling phase, which normally takes somewhere between 3 months for a coal bed methane site up to 6 months for a shale site. At that point, you will see a lot of truck movements, which will obviously be mitigated around local circumstances. You will see a drilling rig, which is about a couple of 100 metres high, which is about the typical size of a mature tree. You will get some noise on the site because of the truck movements, etc. But post that drilling, we will then go into a phase of producing the gas. The wellheads themselves are about 2 metres high. Most of the additional kit is taken off the site, and you're left with a very, very small visual impact, very small noise impact, very small light impact. We've drilled about 30 wells in central Scotland in the last 20 years. Quite a lot in F around the Stirling area. I think you'd find it difficult to find them.
In terms of things like vehicle movements, once the drilling phase is over, I mean, how does the gas extracted? Is that through a pipeline, or are there vehicle movements? How does it work?
Typically in coal bed methane and shale, it will be connected directly to the grid system. There may be some residual gas used for on-site electricity generation. In terms of shale specifically, because shale uses water, typically we try very hard to connect to the mains water system, and then the wastewater would go out via trucks during the hydraulic fracturing process. Coal bed methane doesn't involve hydraulic fracturing in Scotland, so that wouldn't occur. But again, that's just during effectively the drilling phase. Once that's out of the way, truck movements become quite small.
Thank you. Jules McCullough.
Thank you very much, Convener. In terms of coal bed methane, you talked about the visual impact there. As I understand it, you need to sink quite a number of wells often. I know that in my area, in Canonby, for example, I think there have been 19 different sites of drilling in one quite small area. Is that typical of the industry?
In terms of coal bed methane, it really does depend on geology, the sweet spots where the gas is, etc. But you tend to find wells are grouped together. So there's a planning application in the F site for 14 wells at the moment. And in terms of shale, when you go into a shale production site, again, you'll probably see about 10 wells on the size of a football, maybe 2 football pitch size piece of land.
So, if that's in the middle of nowhere, then probably nobody's bothered. But if it's in the middle of a housing estate, then it's going to have quite a significant impact, isn't it? Or if it's in a small rural village like Canonby, in the area that I represent, it's going to have quite a significant impact.
I think any energy production, whether it's building new nuclear power, whether it's building wind farms, etc., does involve a certain amount of truck movements at the start of that process. Once the process, whether it's coal bed methane or shale, has started and the drilling has finished and you're into production of hydrocarbons, the amount of truck movements, the amount of visual impact, noise, light pollution goes down to a bare minimum.
But you said earlier that you need to remove water. Is that for the whole duration of the extraction phase?
The water coming out of unconventionals only for shale. Coal bed methane doesn't use water in the same way. It's just during the hydraulic fracturing phase. Between 25 and 75% of the water that's used during the hydraulic fracturing phase comes back within the first week or two. So it's during that phase, which is directly after the drilling phase. But once you get into the production of gas, the truck movements do go down to a minimum.
Where does the water go?
The water will go to be treated. A lot of the biggest issue is around normally occurring radioactive material, which is obviously brought back up to the surface with the water. That's treated in line with SEPA regulations and then will be disposed of in according to SEPA regulations.
Sorry, just to reiterate, so radioactive materials brought up with the water?
A small amount of normally occurring radioactive material is brought back with the water because you're obviously dealing at significant depths. But that's not unusual in terms of gas and oil production.
Given that many of these proposals are in very built-up areas, if I was living in one of those areas, I'd be extremely alarmed.
Normally occurring radioactive materials are produced in a number of different industries. It's heavily regulated by CEPA. We have one of the best regulation systems in the world in terms of environmental regulation, both in Scotland and in the rest of the UK. And I don't think that local residents have anything to fear by that issue.
What about heavy metals? Are they brought up with the water as well?
Some heavy metals may be brought up depending on the geology, and that again is one of the site-by-site specific natures of the issue that we work very closely with CEPA on.
I would like to say I'm reassured, but unfortunately I can't.
Hans Malik.
Yes, you go to great pains to emphasise the fact that traffic movement goes down to a bare minimum. What is a bare minimum?
It's in terms of coal bed methane, for example, it's just maintenance crews going in on the occasional basis to look at the site to make sure it's operating properly, etc. But most of the truck movements happen when the drilling kit goes onto the site, and in terms of shale, obviously you then have truck movements associated with some of the chemicals and some of the wastewater coming back out. But in terms of coal bed methane, you don't have that, and that goes down to a bare minimum. Once the drilling's finished and the drill rig's gone, etc., you are left with a 2-metre wellhead which produces the gas.
Just to follow up, Chit, and during the process, what is the perceived level of traffic? I mean, when you say that in the beginning there's going to be a lot of movement, how would we measure that? What's the footprint for that for any given area? I mean, if we are talking about operating in a small rural area which will have minor roads, what's the impact on the road surface? What's the impact on traffic, health and safety and stuff?
Yeah. As part of any planning process we do, either in Scotland or the rest of the UK, there is a traffic management plan agreed with the local council and also with CEPA or the Environment Agency. There are various estimates out there in terms of truck movements, but it really does depend quite a lot on the geology. Operators, before they put in planning applications, will visit the local areas that they want to operate in, will talk to the local communities about how you mitigate truck movements and things. So, for example, there are a number of sites in the UK recently that have agreed with the local communities that truck movements won't happen around a certain time of the day, you know, schools, etc. There are other operators that have agreed not to use specific roads at specific times. So it's all quite well managed in terms of that. And I've seen estimates out there that truck movements are no different from building a housing estate in the early stages, or even the movement of parts for wind farms.
Alison?
Even if we could be absolutely reassured about methane gas leaks or fugitive emissions and so on, it would be the case that we would be adding to Scotland's climate change emissions. You'll be aware that the government hasn't managed to meet its climate change targets the last couple of years. Has there been any discussion with the Scottish Government on the impact such activity would have?
We've had minor discussions so far with the Scottish Government. 80% of our heat and cooking in Scotland comes from gas. By 2030, 80% of that will come from outside of the UK, principally from Qatar and principally from Europe. Europe will use pipelines, which has a significant transmission loss and therefore an economic and environmental impact. The rest will come from LNG from places like Qatar. The LNG process of gasification and liquefaction and transport uses about 13% of the gas transported. Again, that's a fairly large economic and environmental impact. So therefore, we believe that shale gas, firstly, has a role to play in reducing that import dependency and therefore the environmental kick-on from that. Secondly, in terms of the UK, we produce 40% of our electricity from coal. I think the Scottish figure is now around about 20%. And again, we feel that gas generation has 50% of the CO2 emissions attached to it that coal has. So again, we think that's another target for us. And finally, this debate always gets polarised around electricity. We shouldn't forget the heat, but also we shouldn't forget feedstocks. A large part of the UK's industrial business is surrounded by the use of gas, whether it's fertilisers, petrochemicals, etc. And we only have to look at Grangemouth down the road to see that they are now taking, or will be taking, shale from the US, despite the fact that they sit on top of a very, very large shale reserve. And again, I think we need to consider that as well in terms of both the economic and the environmental impact.
Just a final question, Convener. Certainly in parts of the United States and in Australia, unconventional gas extraction has proved very controversial, terribly unpopular, with some companies simply having to face facts that it was just impossible for them to go ahead with their business there because of community concerns. Do you understand why people are so concerned about this technology, given the information that we've seen emerge from these countries?
I think the first thing is, yes, I do. As a normal citizen, I can understand people's concerns about some of the myths that have come out of the US and other places. I think that there are a number of things to say. First of all of the studies that come out of the US should be treated with a certain element of caution. The industry started there 20-odd years ago and did no baseline monitoring. So we have no idea whatsoever of what gas was already in the water, in the air, etc. In the United Kingdom and in Scotland, we have already agreed with the regulators that we will do monitoring before we start drilling, during drilling, and after drilling to ensure that we have no impact on the surrounding areas. I think, secondly, there are a number of myths out there, like gas coming out of taps, etc.
Can I just interrupt, Convener? Sorry, we've viewed the Gaslands documentary here, and certainly MSPs, including myself, watched the film where taps were exploding when they were turned on, where people were unable to sell their homes. We had a professor from Australia who came and told us about what was happening there. So I probably wouldn't agree with your use of the word myths.
I was going to go on to say that, of course, gas did come out of somebody's tap, but the reality is that that gas was already in the groundwater, and that's where it came from. It would have happened regardless of drilling in the area or not. And that's why I say it's really, really important to start the process off from a scientific basis of monitoring. We can then understand exactly what we've already got in our systems, in our water, in our air, so we can then compare and contrast the issues during drilling and post-drilling. And a lot of the issues that we've seen in America also come down to the fact of very, very poor well design and well integrity. That, again, cannot happen in the UK under the regulations set by the Health and Safety Executive, where we've had very, very stringent well design, well integrity, well examination regulation in this country for over 30 years, without a huge amount of issue. We've drilled in the United Kingdom over 2,000 wells in the last 30 years, and we've hydraulically fractured 200 of those wells, again without issue, all under an extreme amount of very, very good regulation and regulators.
A few members want to come in. We are a little bit short on time. Mr. Allen, brief question, please.
On that particular point, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Governor. Good morning. We had a visit from the State Senator of America last year, and they were surprised to learn that if we had to implement the level of regulation that we have here in the UK, the unconventional gas sector would not be profitable in America. I can't understand. How viable is this industry? Will it be viable tomorrow?
Yes, we do have a huge amount of regulation. The regulation is now being backfilled into the US and is causing them some economic pain. However, we have taken that into account in how you do business in Scotland and the UK. And we still think that this is economically viable, particularly when you look at the cost, both economically and environmentally, compared to imports from Qatar and Russia, etc. It still makes sense for the UK to produce its own indigenous sources of gas, and we do take that into account. We are also in a situation where the gas prices in Europe are about 4 times as high as the US. And finally, I think the big thing in terms of the economic viability is going to come down to how we build the supply chain in the United Kingdom. The IOD numbers talk about a peak investment of £3.7 billion per year in about 10-15 years' time. And what's essential to make that economic is to build a supply chain in the United Kingdom.
But would you accept there is a question mark on it?
I think there is a question mark around geology, around economics, until such time as we get to a steady state of exploration where we really understand the geology, how the gas flows, what the supply chain looks like, etc. But we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't think we could make a margin on it, and also for it to be economically and environmentally make sense for the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
Yes. Just one last question. I take the point that Mr. Cronin made about it makes more indigenous sense to procure local gas. I can't wait for us to produce low-cost gas from the Firth of Clyde and the Near Atlantic, which has been denied to us over the last 30 years. Anyway, we've talked about separation issues and local amenities and encroachment on wild land, environmental impact, visual impact, but at the end of the day, this all depends on the will of communities and the people they're in. And the question I'm going to ask does actually tangentially relate to planning. The community benefits aspect of planning or pursuing planning, in my book, has been an absolute failure because it has not embraced the wider community. What do you think of community equity participation or part community ownership in any of the projects that you have?
Okay. Can I just say that's a slightly off-topic question on MPF3?
It was intended to be.
So if we could have fairly short responses to that, maybe Mr. Bell and Mr. Galloway, very short responses.
If I could start, I think SSE takes community engagement very seriously, and there is a programme of community benefit that is followed as well, and that is linked to the legacy that SSE has in the Highlands from other projects as well. So it's a very active area. I think on the wider question of equity, wearing my other hat, advising developers throughout Scotland on projects is certainly a very prominent point in their consideration, and I can think of a few schemes at the moment that are in pre-planning where we are engaging with communities. They are the ones in the Highlands actually, where we are looking at possible sharing of the project. So it may be, for example, that the community has a set number of turbines within the scheme. They get soft loans for operation and maintenance activity, but they share the revenues over a 25-year period. And I think whilst there is the new protocol of £5,000 per megawatt as a community benefit, I think if we can see more innovative approaches of community ownership, it further buys the communities in to that project. And I can't think of any other industry that is getting a penetration into rural areas such that some fragile communities are being able to see quite significant resources come to them over a 25-year period. I simply don't see any other sector delivering that. So at a time of tight budget constraints for the public sector and the third sector, I think that is a very important consideration that deserves perhaps more attention in policy.
Yeah, to quickly add to that, I think it's worth saying that the Scottish onshore wind industry has led the way in community benefits in a more conventional sense. We were the first to have a community benefit register, which creates transparency for developers and communities about what those levels are and where they're happening across the UK. And we also now have a community benefit protocol, which David mentioned. And we have committed to exploring these more innovative ways for communities to get involved in projects, and we are certainly supportive of continuing to look at that.
In my experience, because of the structure of some communities, just some communities, that it doesn't, the decisions on that, the engagement is not with the wider community. It may be with a few people who represent the community, and we can look at the reasons for it.
Order. Somebody's got a mobile phone on, please. Could they turn it off? Thank you. Carry on, Mr. Brody.
So, you know, the rationale behind it is how do you engage the wider community? And I happen to support community ownership or part ownership of turbines or what have you.
I think also to address those concerns, we've worked closely with the Scottish Government and with Local Energy Scotland to produce good practice guidance for community engagement, which helps to identify local communities, who those people are, who are the groups that developers should be engaging with. And I think there's a lot of good practice out there, which, including the companies represented either side of me here, carry out. And that guidance will be published shortly. It's just gone out to consultation, and it will include, as well as general guidance, a range of case studies to highlight just what is being done across Scotland.
Thank you.
I don't have much to add.
Okay. We've got two questions just to conclude, if nobody else is desperate to come in. Just going back to Mr. Cronin and what you were saying, Mr. Cronin. I mean, clearly, you know, there's a lot of scare stories around about fracking. We're all familiar with them. I noticed that DEC do an annual public attitudes tracker that came out this week that now showed that more people in the UK were in favour of shale gas extraction than against it. Are you encouraged by that?
Yes, I am. Considering everything that's gone on in terms of some of the myths, etc. I think that what's really, really essential here is that operators work directly with the local communities that they want to work within. And that we have a very, very strict community engagement charter that starts off well before the planning process to talk through all of the fears. So you will have seen yesterday, for example, in Lancashire, Quadrilla have made an announcement well ahead of their planning applications and had community engagement meetings, door-to-door meetings, etc., all the way through yesterday. And that's a part of our best practice. We also think that community benefits is important. We have a community benefits scheme. And we also think that community jobs is hugely important as well. And here in Scotland, you know, we are talking here between 300 and 400 suppliers being directly involved in this industry that will create local jobs, etc. And again, we think that's quite important. So we are encouraged. We're also encouraged that people are beginning to understand where their gas and their heat could come from in the future.
And final question, and this is going back to the wild land question, which is a process question to Mr. Bell, Mr. Galloway, Mr. Blameyer. Are you satisfied with the level of consultation there has been around the question of SNH's wild land mapping and its insertion into SPP? Are you content with that, or do you think there should have been greater consultation with stakeholders?
I think there should have been earlier consultation. I think it came rather late, and it was disappointing that there's been a mismatch between having the SPP draft policy and the NPF main issues report without the consultation running in parallel on the mapping. So people have responded to the mapping just in December. So I think an earlier consultation would have been more beneficial, but it's certainly welcome that there was that consultation, and we've been able to make points to SNH on that.
Not much to add to that, but it's just to say that since the consultation has been closed on the SNH mapping process, we're still yet to understand the timescale for which the SNH advice will be made public, and whether that will be made public before SPP is published. So there's no timescale in place at the moment.
Just that it would have been useful that, given that each of us have highlighted various sort of methodological issues, that the process allowed for SNH to further consider that and revise its work as appropriate.
Okay, thank you all very much. It's been a very helpful session. I'm grateful to you for coming in, and we will now have a short suspension to allow a changeover. Thank you. Right, if we can reconvene, I'd like to welcome our second panel of witnesses in MPF3. We're joined by Aidan Smith, who's Head of Planning and Development at RSPB Scotland, and also here representing Scottish Environment Link, Malcolm MacLeod, Head of Planning and Building Standards at Highland Council, and Helen McDade, who is Head of Policy at John Muir Trust. Welcome to you all. I would just reiterate what I said at the start. For those of you who weren't here, I would encourage members to keep their questions short and focused and directed to a particular panel member or members. If you want to answer a question directed to somebody else, just catch my eye and I will bring you in as best we can. And given the time constraints, if everybody can be as short and focused in their questions and in their responses, that would be very helpful. Can I maybe just start off on the question of wild land? You'll have, if you were here for the first panel, you might have heard the comments from the power companies and Scottish Renewables in relation to their concerns about the wildland mapping exercise that's been carried out. Maybe I could ask each of you, maybe start with Aidan Smith and work the way along. What is your view on, first of all, the quality of the work done by SNH, because there were concerns, we heard about that, and secondly, how robustly this should be treated in terms of the planning process, because I know there are concerns about the way this has been inserted or not inserted in MPF3, notwithstanding it was in the major issues assessment done previously. Maybe start with Aidan Smith and work the way along.
Sure, yeah, thanks. Within Scottish Environment Link, there are a range of views on wildland, but overall we're supportive of the principle of it. And the reason for that is because we think it makes sense to have in the National Planning Framework, which is your national spatial strategy for how Scotland is going to develop over the next 20 or 30 years, we think it makes sense to give a spatial steer to nationally important types of development, which, given that we've got targets for increasing renewable energy generation and so on, and there's significant pressure for development for onshore wind, we think that makes sense that the national spatial strategy should identify which areas are more likely to be suitable and less likely to be suitable for development, to make sure that we get it to the most effective places and try and reduce conflicts and make the process clearer and simpler for everybody. In terms of the robustness and quality of the methodology which has gone into the wildland identification process, it's probably not something for Scottish Environment Link to comment on. I think others are probably better placed to do that. But it's really just sort of re-emphasising, I guess, that Link are very supportive of the principle of giving this spatial steer to development types, and that doesn't apply just to onshore wind. It could apply to other development types as well. It makes sense to identify which areas are more sensitive and less sensitive to different types of development.
Okay, thank you. Mr MacLeod.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Highland Council position on this is that wildland is already a planning consideration that we recognise within our Highland-wide local development plan. And it is something that, as a council, we do acknowledge the key role that these core areas of wildland play in supporting our tourism industry, which is incredibly important in an area like Highland, as you know. So, generally speaking, we welcome the progression that's been made towards having a more substantial policy around wildland and also the mapping, the work that's been done. However, we do have a number of what we regard as fairly serious concerns. Some have been raised in regard to the methodology that's been used. And particularly issues around the inclusion of areas of plantation forestry, or how existing consented wind farms have been treated within the surveying exercise, even though I do recognise that SNH have addressed it, but we still remain concerned about it. But fundamentally, the Council has an issue over the extent of these areas. And particularly given that the areas as currently shown include areas of lower wildness qualities, and there is that gradation within it. At the moment, areas of the core areas of wildland cover 42% of the Highland landmass, and that is of some concern to our members. It's not just about onshore wind, it's also the threat, potentially, about what it means for other forms of development, albeit recognising that it's not a designation, but that still gives us challenges. Is it a designation or is it not a designation? There's also an issue over our capacity to deliver renewables. We have a good track record of meeting of delivering towards the Scotland-wide renewable target. And obviously there is a concern around our capacity to deliver further. We are concerned about buffer areas. What happens out with these areas? Because they have lines drawn around them. So what's the difference between these areas and things like an NSA, a National Scenic Area, where the indirect impacts, the impacts from out with an area, also have to be considered. And I think a number of our members also have some trouble with the implication or the outcome from this, which is that given that they cover such a wide part of our area, what that does is push developments closer to our populated areas. And we did make a submission to the original consultation with mapping, which perhaps shows that very clearly, that the areas shown which would be out with these core areas certainly are closer to populated areas. So to sum up, we are disappointed that there was no change to the core areas of wild land between the original submission and the supplementary consultation. And given some of the significant concerns that I've just outlined, we wish to be involved and would like to be involved in working with SNH, Scottish Government, in order to finalise before it is part of the published SPP.
Thanks very much for allowing the Trust to give evidence on this important issue. I think it's worth looking at a bit of context. I realise you're pressed for time, but we have slight concerns about this just being looked at in relation to onshore wind. This is about what's important to Scotland. This is about vision and strategy, which the MPF is about. And in fact, we were very supportive of the draft that came out last year because we felt that that included it. We would have preferred to see this being looked at by the Rural Affairs Committee. This is not just about a constraint to onshore wind. And so that's quite a major point. What is the economic benefit, even just looking at that? What's the economic benefit of protecting these areas properly? And there is a lot of evidence coming forward about the impact that this could have on tourism. It's frequently said there's no evidence on this. In fact, ironically, a big part of the SNH's consultation, which did go on, the SNH consulted on the core land map for a couple of years. Highland Council were part of that, so I'm slightly surprised they think they weren't involved. But then what they did was the public perception survey with the national parks, something the government really recognises as crucially important, people's view of national parks. And there was consultation, a major consultation, about what people perceived of wildness and how important it was to them. And overwhelmingly, the results of that, which I don't think really did feed back into the final map, which could have been enlarged, frankly, I think it was pretty much the status quo. But it reassured anybody who has read that study that actually people are really proud, if they're Scottish, of what we have in our wild areas, and people want it better protected. And the further consultation on the core wildland map, which has just finished, 80% of the responses want good protection for wild land. It includes local authorities, 6 local authorities. It includes communities. Of course, some communities have concerns, some don't. Communities are not one thing. So I think it's really important that this committee looks slightly above what are the constraints for onshore wind here. There's been talk about targets. The targets are for renewables. We need more vision. We need to be looking at the research and development, at the geothermal, at the solar. That is not coming forward in the way that it should. And some of us might think that is because, actually, it's just too easy to get to put up wind turbines in areas which in 20 years' time, like plantation forestry in the flow country, folk are going to turn around and say, oh, that was a bit of a pity. How will we reclaim it? So the specific of your question about what about the consultation here, has it been adequate? There's a response from the world-renowned experts, Leeds University Wildland Research Institute, to the core map, saying this is the best in the world. This is an opportunity for Scotland to say, we really value what we've got. We frequently come up in the top 10 destinations for natural tourism. The figures are there from SNH about how important that is. Jobs are not one-sided. It's not all jobs in renewables or no jobs. There's a lot of jobs in that. So we are slightly concerned that obviously the committee has to focus, but I hope that when you look at that, you will look at that other side of the economic benefit as well as what people think important. With regards to the specific of the core area wildland map, SNH were consulting on this for 2 years. Highland Council, Western Isles Council were both involved in that. But also, there's been a further consultation. And actually, the responses wanting greater protection have gone up from 2 to 1 in favour to 4 to 1 in the recent round. Now, that's our analysis, because SNH will take a few weeks to get theirs out. But the SNH results should be out in time for the committee to go back and look at that. So it's not all one-sided, and yeah, we think it's a very positive step forward and could be world-renowned.
Okay, thank you for that. I should have said at the start, and put this on the record, we'd been hoping to have Steve Rogers, who's Head of Planning and Regulatory Services from Dumfries and Galloway, joining us this morning, but he's got waylaid and is not able to come. Okay, just on this issue of wildland, I think, Mike McKenzie, you want to...
Thank you, Convener. I just think, just to set the context, I'm always disturbed by this phrase, wildland, because you probably will remember that when Andrew Thinn of SNH was giving evidence to the committee, I asked him where this wildland is, because I've been searching the Highlands and Islands for a number of years, looking for it, and Andrew said to me quite clearly on the record that there was no wildland in Scotland, and my question therefore is to Miss McDade, because I'm a bit concerned on reading your written submission that you feel that you would like to extend this 2.5 kilometre buffer zone, as it were, or separation, to include, you know, that separation to apply for single dwellings. And when I kind of draw that map mentally in my mind, I kind of arrive at a situation where it wouldn't be possible to erect a single wind turbine anywhere across the Highlands and Islands. Is that really the aspiration of the John Muir Trust, or am I misinterpreting what you've written?
I think our point is actually different. What we were saying was, and it was actually referred to by David Bell earlier, that currently the 2 kilometre distance from housing actually doesn't apply to single or dwellings or a small community of houses. It only applies when they're regarded as settlements, whether that's a hamlet or a village, I'm not sure. And David Bell said that quite clearly. This is not what happens at the moment. And our point really was that that is an issue that needs looked at. We weren't actually saying go beyond, far from it, going beyond 2.5 kilometres. We were saying this is currently not done at 2 kilometres. Many people have turbines less than a kilometre from them because they're single houses or just a few houses, and that's an important issue for communities. You know, we put that in as part of the evidence that the committee is looking for. Obviously, the John Muir Trust is mainly focused on the core wildland areas. That's what we're about, but we are also interested in how communities are affected, and you just need to look at the concern that has been raised about the Bewley-Denny substation at Balblair, where David Bell said earlier, all these things are already taken into account by the process that the companies go through. Well, at Bewley-Denny, that was a discussion that went on, but now communities are very concerned that they can't sit outside their houses because they feel they're too close to the substation and that that's impacting on them. So it was to make the point that we don't have that separation of 2 kilometres at the moment, so that has to be recognised that there are people impacted by much less distance.
So you're talking about increasing this, just not, you know, from a situation where it's guidance for bigger wind farm developments to include a prohibition for individual turbines?
No, we said we would raise the need for planning to protect individual houses in future because there is evidence that that has not been done. We did not say either extend it or absolute prohibition. What we're saying is the current system's not working.
Current system's not working, and so you're... I'm still not quite clear what it is you're asking for.
I think we're asking for individuals to have their rights respected in the planning process as well as larger communities. And, you know, I suppose I'm agreeing with David Bell on one point there, that actually one size doesn't fit all. It's about looking at what's happening and saying how can the process improve that.
Okay, thank you. And further questions for Mr Smith, because I'm concerned at the extent, for instance, that the humble corncrake is able to blight developments of all sorts, and I just wonder if your priorities are, you know, to replace the few human populations that we'll have in the Highlands and Islands with bird populations.
Well, absolutely not, of course, and we've got many members in the Highlands and Islands and many members of staff who live and work in the Highlands and Islands as well. I think what we're doing here, which is the same approach that we always take to planning, which is that in the first instance it makes sense to carry out development in a way which minimises its impacts on the environment. So if we have knowledge that one part of the environment is more sensitive than another, it makes sense to steer development in the first instance away from that. It doesn't mean that development can't happen there, but if there are options, then you would choose the least environmentally damaging option. And effectively, at a large scale, that's what this discussion is about in relation to wild land. We can look at other things which we can map spatially as well to identify which bits of the country are more sensitive and less sensitive, and we can do it at a more local level and steer development to those least sensitive areas. That seems to be kind of good planning sense, but also good sense in terms of trying to make Scotland the sort of place we want to live in 20 or 30 years.
So if you have a single kind of cruising male corncrake looking for a girlfriend, maybe kind of getting off the normal pathways, that's not a reason to blight what are otherwise good developments. You would discourage planning authorities from taking that kind of viewpoint.
Well, what we're interested in is what sort of impact there's going to be on the species as a whole, rather than necessarily for the individual cruising corncrake. In some instances, for some species that are particularly rare, then it might be that an impact on a small number of individuals might be of concern, but it's really about what the impact is going to be at the population level. And again, it's not about stopping development happening, it's about making development happen in a way which is sustainable and isn't going to be impacting on sensitive bits of the natural environment.
I'm sure the fate of the cruising corncrake is of great interest, but it's slightly off the subject of the NPF3.
I would beg to differ, Convener, because I would beg to differ. And the point that I'm trying to get at here is, and I think Mr MacLeod, I think, raised this point, and it's given the new Scottish planning policy, given the national planning framework, that I think it's crucially important that the guidance that government gives to local planning authorities is absolutely clear. And I think also, that Miss McDade from John Muir Trust and NSPB also have an obligation to make their points very clearly and unambiguously in terms of what they're seeking. And government who have to arbitrate have to, and I think we'll have the opportunity of questioning the Minister later, but it seems to me that none of us benefit, on either side of these arguments, none of us benefit from the kind of grey area approach that seems to be emerging as a result of the answers. And that's why I'd asked the questions. It's very important that we've got clarity. So, but I think I've said what I want to say, so thank you.
Thank you. Hans Alamak.
Good morning. Malcolm, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. You made a couple of statements, so I'm just looking for some clarity in them. And one of the statements you made was that you felt that there was a threat to other projects or developments. And so what is this threat that you mentioned? It's quite strong language, but what is the threat and where does the evidence come from that you cite?
Well, I think our concern is that with these very extensive areas of wild land, that there would be a, depending on the policy that finally comes out in the agreed, approved SPP, that there will be a presumption against development within these core areas of wild land. That isn't just about renewable energy, it's also about other forms of development.
You're quite strong in your language in terms of you perceived a threat.
Yes.
And I'm just wanting to know,
well,
where did this evidence come from?
Well, the evidence is that we've seen, for example, across the Highlands, a large number of hydro schemes, small-scale hydro schemes, that are coming forward, and particularly in West Highlands. We are seeing estate diversification. We're seeing other forms of development, whether they're tourism-related or indeed other forms of renewables, in what will be within these extended areas of core areas of wild land. So it's a concern that we've noted that depending on what the final policy is, this could lead to a prohibition, if you like, on these types of development. So that's the concern. And it's a function of the extent of our area. 42% is covered by these wild areas. I touched on buffer areas, which I think is really important, is what happens just out with that. So if you want to do something just out with one of these areas of wild land.
Fair to say that then what you're really doing is putting a marker down that there may be an issue rather than a threat. Because to use
it may be a threat.
Okay. Play on words, but we're not getting anywhere with it. So you've not really got any substantial evidence to back that up.
Well, at the moment we've got an approach in Highland which allow us to make a judgment on wild land. That's our current approach. Now we've always said we want more clarity. We would appreciate more clarity. At the moment we take I think a pragmatic approach in Highland. For all types of development, and a judgment on the degree of wildness or the level of national importance of the wild land that may or may not be affected by development. So at the moment we manage it by dealing with applications on their merits and by using the policy we've got. If that's taken out of our hands, that's I think where the concern is, and the concern raised by members was that our ability to manage that and to perhaps look at developments that might be less have less of an impact on wild land would perhaps not be capable of being managed by Highland Council. That's our concern.
You could send me the details, and because you've not been able to impress me about this threat that you talked about. The other issue you mentioned, as I said, your members have shared concerns with you. Now, which are the members that are sharing the concern, and how they communicate that concern to you, and what are the concerns?
We had a full debate on this at our January Planning, Environment and Development Committee, where members from right across the Highlands contributed to a debate on it. And their concerns ranged from the ones that I've tried to express today to those that want to see the wild areas that are currently shown maintained. So, you know, there was a view across the Highlands that lots of different views on wild land, but you know, individual threats. I mean, if you're looking for individual projects or individual schemes, that's not what I was talking about. I was talking of the more general feeling that what is happening here is that we have these very wide areas of wild land, which are larger than the search areas for wild land that previously existed, and that the feeling was that if people were coming along with smaller scale renewable schemes, hydro included, if people were coming forward with estate diversification schemes, if people were coming forward with tourism development schemes within these areas, which are recognised as having lower qualities of wildness, that these would somehow or very likely be prohibited by the approach that's currently been taken. And they were genuine concerns made by members in that debate, and I'm happy to send a copy of
I don't want to take away people's passion or emotion. What I am keen to do is to find fact from fiction. I think that's the important element for me. So if you can share that information, which is evidence-based, I'd be very interested to receive it.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on some of that because obviously council members, like everybody else, they don't all think the same thing. And in Highland Council, there's at least 2 councillors who are routinely barred from taking any part in decisions on wind development because they've raised issues. So, I mean, that's a concern in itself when you're looking for open debate on those councils. I'm surprised, really, Mr MacLeod isn't coming up with some specifics because there are, in fact, several developments currently in the process in planning in Highland, which are in search areas for wildland. And so I would like to bring us back to what's a national planning framework and what was in it before and what the Minister said. And I know you'll have the opportunity to ask him about that in a minute. So, in the last National Planning Framework, there was protection for wildland areas, regardless of your definition. The government obviously was comfortable with that, and there are search areas, and already there are developments coming forward in those areas, quite contrary to what happened at the early stages of wind development, where you can see from what's already up that it was mainly up the east in the less wild areas. So that's now pushing into these much wilder areas. Now, the Ministers, Mackay and Wheelhouse, both said last April at the Public Petitions Committee that it was their intention that it would continue to be strong protection for wild areas. That was continued on in the main issues report, which said that they wish to continue strong protection for the wildest landscapes. So it was quite clear last summer where the government was going with this. And the question really is, in the absence of those words being in the National Planning Framework draft before you, whether they've changed their minds. And if they have, I think that needs to be teased out. I don't think that's what's happened. I think the words have just got dropped in the word count. And what we're asking, to come back to Mr Mackenzie's point about be clear about what you're asking for, we're asking for those words or similar words to be reinserted in the National Planning Framework. It is the spatial document, it is the statutory framework, and the discussion about call is a bit of a distraction. We don't know what's in the SPP. We don't know where that's finally going to go. But there is a search area at the moment which is important, and the government has indicated they intend to continue that protection. And it is again about taking that higher view of what's important to the country and should be protected, and what you're going to let go.
Let's go in with a brief follow-up.
Yes, and it was really just a question for Mr MacLeod, but I'm asking it in the sense that I'm hoping to clarify this a wee bit, and also for the benefit of Mr Malik, who possibly doesn't get the same opportunity of travelling over the Highlands and Islands as I do, and it seems to me that there are, if we accept this unfortunate word wild, then there are degrees of wildness. Now, I would ask Mr MacLeod, for instance, if the very large areas of Highland Council that are covered with spruce plantation, for instance, if he regards that as a largely man-made landscape nowadays, as compared with some of the other wilder areas and that may require protection, and that perhaps this SNH wild map doesn't differentiate between the different qualities of land sufficiently. Would you agree with me on that?
One of the issues that we've raised is the fact that plantation forestry is included within the methodology, and that there are the core areas of wild land, and the core areas of wild land, in our view, in the Council's view, are the areas where we wish to see this approach taken forward, that we should be focusing on the core areas and not having these very wide areas that include lesser levels of wildness.
Thank you. Joan McCall.
Thanks very much. Just to go back to this issue that was raised by Mr Malik, and I think Helen McDade was referring to it in her opening remarks, where she said that she was disappointed that the wildland issue was only being focused on wind turbines. Are you suggesting you would like to see other developments included in that? Like, and if so, what other kind of developments?
But that wasn't the point. The point was really that we thought it sat more naturally in the natural heritage part of the National Planning Framework as what is regarded as important. That discussion we've just had about looking at what we value for what it brings to the country. And there's no question, this is not a designation. It's not in there as a designation. It's not in about these things that Mr MacLeod just raised. And just to put on the record, John Muir Trust, I've been thinking about it since he mentioned it. I think we've opposed 2 mini hydro schemes maximum. So these are not the sort of things that we're expecting. They're not going to be taken in by this. This is about a very specific issue about the major impacts that you get from these huge commercial developments. If you look at Mr Bell's evidence earlier, and this is quite difficult because the panel you have here, we still have somebody arguing against the core areas of wild land. So we're trying to pick up a lot of points. But Mr Bell, raised the issue about having the ability to look at this in the planning system without it being rigid and without there being a line on the map. The truth of the matter is, it is planners who have asked for the lines on the map because they don't seem to have been able to get to grips with doing the environmental assessment in a way that does not lead to us all sitting at public inquiries for developments which are in core areas of wild land. So this is about the specific impacts of those. There's 20, 30 kilometres routinely of road there that will not be taken out. It's just not correct to say that it will be restored to its previous situation. So it's about those bigger issues, not about these small community schemes, which we support. We support North Harris Trust application to put up 3 commercial turbines. We support other that impact in communities. I agree that it should be easier for communities to put forward smaller schemes than for these large schemes. It is about the specific impact, and that's obviously the way it's been brought forward into the MPF. What I was saying was that for the wording, this should apply to what we think is good, what we think is important, in there with peatlands, woodlands, our greater natural heritage.
I'm making is that the last panel, I asked them whether they were concerned that this designation of wild land would affect other developments, not just wind farms, and they did say that that was a concern, particularly given that we have to upgrade our power transmission system over the next few years, and that represents a huge investment in terms of jobs, and also we need it in order to export our energy and transmit our energy. One of the things I asked the panel was whether they thought that hydro schemes that had happened in the 40s and 50s under Tom Johnson and absolutely transformed the Highlands would have gone ahead if we were having this discussion about wild land at the time. What's your view of that? Do you think they should have? Do you think they spoil the Highlands?
No, taking your points in turn, I mean, it's just to be clear, it is not a designation that's been discussed. It is specifically in the SPP about dealing with the difficulties of large-scale wind development. So this is not about a designation. That is not the way it's been brought forward. So I think that concern can be laid to rest. Taking the Tom Johnston point, I actually think it's a really interesting comparison, because if you compare what happened then with what we're looking at now, it was completely different. We had a nationalised industry, which we had a national energy programme going forward with a vision from the top, from Tom Johnston. And indeed, not all schemes that were proposed went ahead because of the environment. It wasn't as if they just thought, put it anywhere and everybody was happy. There was still that discussion. And Glen Nevis was put forward, for instance, as a possible place that hydro would go forward, and it was not used because of the iconic nature of that area.
Saying that if the large-scale wind farms were owned by the public, that it would be all right.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that national energy strategy would really help us all here, a national spatial strategy showing what the developments across the different kinds of energy that we need are and where they would go, and looking at that and also looking at the costs. This is something that's been called for by the Institute of Engineers and Shipbuilders in Scotland and many other engineering groups who are very concerned about the disjointed way in which the current system we have brings forward developments. So you can get a very poor development suggested in a wildland area or indeed some other area that's special importance. And it might get the go-ahead because it's first in the planning queue. So there's a real problem with us not having that overarching national strategy. That's really what I'm trying to say.
Smith, I think you were keen to come in.
Yeah, I was just wanting to sort of go back to what the mapping is about, I guess, and this kind of strategic spatial mapping really serves as much as anything else to highlight sensitivities. So it's not that these are no-go areas, and in fact it could also be turned around and perhaps suggested that the areas which aren't mapped are perhaps opportunity areas. But effectively what it is it's a guide to show that some areas are more likely to be sensitive and some areas are less likely to be sensitive. And what that should do is be useful to planning authorities and to developers when they're considering building their developments. When they're doing their site search work, they can see that on a map and see if they go to this location, then they're going to have to address certain issues, and if they go to another location, they might not have to address those issues. So that should help reduce some of the conflict we sometimes get into when we get to the individual application stage, if they've got that steer at that level. And I think it's kind of a bit of a pity in some ways that we end up always with these discussions getting really drawn onto the wild land issue. It is an important issue, of course, but there are other types of things which can be mapped, could usefully be done, and this could usefully be done in the national planning framework. So one of the things which has been discussed already is peatlands, for instance. And given the nature of wind farms, which are about reducing our carbon emissions, it makes sense in the first instance to be siting wind farms where they have the most carbon benefit, and that means avoiding the deepest areas of peat. It doesn't mean they can't necessarily go on peatlands, but we should be in full knowledge of what the implications are going to be and what the benefits are going to be when they're going to be sited. So you would want to make a decision in the first instance to avoid siting on deeper areas of peat if at all possible. So that sort of steer is what this is about, rather than it being a blanket development can't happen on this type of site or blanket development can happen on this sort of site. It's a steer to highlight to developers and to decision makers that these things need to be considered.
So I just wanted to clarify one thing that Ms McDade mentioned, and just for the Highland Council is not against core areas of wildland. That wasn't what I was saying. I was not saying that we are against core areas of wildland. We feel that the extent of these areas, as they're currently presented, are too large.
Well, thank you. That's quite helpful clarity. Okay, I think Mr. Allard next.
Thanks very much, Convener. I just wanted to go back to what Ms McDade said about having wind farm after 20 years, what's happening after 20 years, what's left with them. And I see on your submission that you are challenging, and you wanted to remove the statement removed, the third NPF, which set out the government's development priorities over the next 20 to 30 years. I've got problem to reconcile the two, because to a certain extent, 20 years is 25 years for a life of such a project, and so after 25 years it will go back to normal. So 25 to 30 years for this kind of project, it seems to be just on time. And I would like to know what the other members of the panel think about the 25 to 30 years, if they agree with Ms McDade and with the submission that that should be removed.
I think there are two different points. The point about the MPF and the 25 to 30 years is a general one about it's very hard to envisage what our technology will be like in 15 years, 20 years. So to embed in the national planning framework national developments with that kind of timescale on the assumption that we can envision what we will have, you know, it could be a different world. And so it's the real problem is around the need for the development being regarded as proven if it's included in the list of national developments. And that causes quite a number of issues, because if something changes, let's say, solar is revolutionised, and even in Scotland it becomes the much better renewable technology, you might have embedded in a national development something which was aimed at your vision of where onshore wind was going, for instance. But it could be something entirely different. It could be broadband. We might all be using something else. So it is about bearing in mind that you have to revisit the need for a project when it comes forward, because the whole costs and benefits could have changed dramatically. So it's a point about national developments being included as a need. Your point about restoring after 20, 25 years is a different point. My point was that there really is no intention to remove the roads that are put in and the hard standings for these developments. So, you know, it's just incorrect to say that it will be restored to what it was. And you just need to look back. You go for a walk and you come across concrete bases that were there for Nissen huts for the Second World War, to see that it doesn't just all go away. And when you look at the scale of what's going in there, that has to be remembered. So it's not restoration fully.
I still cannot reconcile the need to remove the statement with 20 to 30 years, and you asking for the same the NPF to have more vision and more strategy. You know, I don't think that we can have a strategy and more vision if you don't have a lifespan which would be at least 20 to 30 years.
I think
what do you propose? What time do you propose?
Yeah, no, you have to have at your top line what you think that 20 to 30 year vision is. The point we're making is that when you go further down into the spatial strategy, you have to bear in mind that there has to be a way of revisiting this if things have changed within that timescale. It mustn't embed it in concrete.
Anybody else?
Well, I think just on the point of the vision, I think MPF, the role of MPFs and SPP at the moment is critical in giving us certainty, because decisions that we make locally will be based on our local development plans that are updated on a regular basis, on a 5-year basis. And I think part of the difficulty and why we're seeking clarity in this matter is that we can now actually move on, get our spatial framework together and move on and be ready to review it in 5 years' time. But the MPF, in terms of providing our big picture, is doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
You are delighted with the 20 to 30 years' time?
Absolutely. We've got to look forward.
In terms of whether it's 20 to 30 years that it looks ahead or a different time period, Link doesn't particularly have a view on, but Link's always been supportive of the principle of having a national planning framework and a national spatial vision for Scotland, which gives an indication of what Scotland's going to look like in the future. So we're very supportive of the principle of it. Link long advocated for it before it was introduced, and colleagues in other UK countries, for instance, are quite jealous that Scotland has a document like this, because it does provide a really useful steer. Doesn't necessarily mean we agree with everything that's in it, of course, but the principle of it is great. Yeah.
Thank you. Right, thank you. Chief Brody.
Thank you. Morning. This is like trying to grab a bar of wet soap. I mean, we've asked questions before about please define what wild land is. I've still got a meaningful answer. Confusion between wild land and wildness. Let me therefore ask you the question: how thorough do you think the mapping of wild land is defined? How thorough do you think the SNH mapping has been? All of them.
In terms of the methodology, I think it's a big step forward. I mean, it shows, instead of it being what was there and...
My question was how thorough.
How thorough, sorry. I think it's as thorough as it could be. I mean, it includes all of the issues that, it needs to include. And what I think, the reason I answered like that is because plantation forestry, consented wind turbine schemes, plantation forest has been included, consented wind farms and the effect of these consented wind farms weren't included. So these are its weaknesses from Highland Council's point of view. But in terms of moving the debate on, I agree. We have been discussing this for years within Highland Council, and it's been through various iterations. So the point we're at just now, I think you've identified the mapping has been thorough. It's been effective in identifying.
I asked you how thorough it would be.
I'm saying it is thorough, and it has identified the core areas of wild land, and we would like to see just the core areas of wild land brought forward as a. And I know it's not a designation, but if lines are going to be shown, we would prefer they had just the core areas of wild land, which we believe are based on a thorough methodology.
I can just follow that then, and Mr MacLeod, if I may. You said, and I quote, lots of different views. There are lots of different views of wild land. Isn't that the case that, and I think the point you were making, that you would endorse more a case-by-case approach rather than a direct development management approach to wildland protection?
Well, I think that's why that's the way we have we've approached things up to now. We have been dealing with things as they're presented on the basis of the mapping that was there. But in some ways, everyone wants more clarity. We want to be able to draw. That's a wrong terminology. Draw a line, but we want to be able to set the policy and being clear as possible, and that if we are to have lines, I think it'll be a positive tool to help us avoid the situations we've ended up getting into. Although I still believe that particularly in the buffer areas around wild land, and indeed in the areas that have lower levels of wild land, the lower gradation, we're still going to end up with debates. And we're still going to end up having testing around the boundaries of these things. And to me, that's why we should be absolutely clear about what core wild land is, with the highest levels of wildness, and allow us to have that judgment and debate in those areas of lesser wild land. Because despite the situations we have ended up in, some have been more controversial than others, But ultimately, that's, you know, there will always be a judgment in these things, and I think...
Just, if I may ask Helen, sorry, Mr. McDade, on that basis, isn't the situation in market conditions in terms of, you know, prohibitive cost would secure wild land? And you're not going to get people, as Mr. MacLeod talking about, looking at investment, infrastructure, transport infrastructure, you know, other resources to invest in what Mr. MacLeod, as I understand it, refers to as core wild land. So that element, which contributes to tourism and other, you know, natural benefits, wouldn't be impacted.
I'd like to give you a definition of wild land, Mr. Brodie. Well, it's not the first one. It's, you know, there's many definitions. The John Muir Trust is that it's extensive areas of high-value natural landscape and wildlife with little evidence of human development. And there's a reason why there's a discussion about the development and particularly a discussion about the definition of wild land, which is in Europe, where there's going to be money going into wilderness areas over there. They've got a definition of wilderness, which we do not fulfil because we're an island and we are, you know, we're more populated than some of the areas of Central Europe. And so we don't fulfil that. We're not going to get that money unless we get in there and point out that we have a really good quality environment here, which they could help us protect as well. So I just wanted to say that you can have a definition of it, but actually people do kind of know where it is. And I would go back to the previous panel where Brian Galloway of Scottish Power said we see ourselves as a responsible developer and we already assess for this. And I would agree with that because we've never opposed a Scottish Power development. I'm pretty certain I can say that. And so, yes, people do kind of recognise it, and there are differences. To go back to your point about further development, I am slightly confused. People do come here, you know, if you ask the questions, if you look at the public perception survey of over 1,000 people, people do come for the natural environment. And of course it's not all the same. If you look at the national park, Aviemore is not the same as the top of the Cairngorm, but people come because they know that that national park description will give them something and an experience of the natural world that they really want and value. And it will be the same with wild land. It's not unusual to have a boundary which you can argue about. Everything isn't contours. The national parks are the same, and indeed one of the first things that the 2007 Scottish Government did when they came in was extend the boundary of the national park with support from organisations like ourselves.
But some of it, and you know, particularly when you mention tourism, it flies in the face of the report that we had when we were doing the renewable inquiry, I think with Ms Cunningham at the University of Edinburgh. So what I'm trying to get to is, you know, you say you know where the wild land is, and you've defined it, thank you. And yet we've just heard from SSE and Scottish Power that SNH apparently can't carry out a robust mapping exercise. Perhaps they should talk to you.
No, sorry, I forgot to come back to that point. Absolutely, we think that SNH have done a major job on this. The amount of technical detail that has gone into the mapping is huge, and people should look at it if they think that SNH have just done some kind of desktop exercise.
You think that and you think otherwise?
Well, you know, you have to look at who's got a vested interest. I mean, you know, obviously, well, to some extent, but yeah, that's what you have to look at. That's what politicians have to decide. Whose vested interest, you know, is more significant. And if you look at the responses to SNH's core land map, of the 329 people or organisations that were for the call, this is the ones that have just come out, there's 59 not-for-profit organisations, 6 local authorities, Sports Scotland, Historic Scotland, Forestry Commission, assortment of community councils, campaign groups, park authorities, the Speyside Business Alliance, which includes people like Grant's Whisky. Against the wildland map, there's 9 individuals as opposed to 264, 40 businesses, 27 of them are energy corporations, 11 property developers, etc. Yeah, let's look at the list and let's say whose is the most vested interest.
What about the people that are impacted by it, the communities?
Well, as I say, there were community councils that are in favour of this, and there's community councils who are not. And
you know as well as I do that community councils, in some cases, are not elected by the largest part of the community. So my question to you is, where's the evidence from the people who are most affected regarding development or not of wild land? as defined by you?
The evidence is in the public perception survey done by SNH, the two national parks. They specifically looked at a group of residents in the Cairngorms National Park, and their you can separate out their answers from the Cross Scotland survey and from people that you might regard as odd like us, people from our organisations. So there's 3 different groups in that survey. It's an excellent piece of work. I'm sure Mr MacLeod will have looked at it as well, and I think it bears looking at. Also, there is a YouGov poll of 1,119 Scots, which said 51% of them would be less likely to visit an area of naturalness if it had a lot of wind farms in it. 2% said they'd be more likely to. I sometimes feel like we're lemmings running towards the edge of a cliff, and we say to each other, there's no evidence that when we jump off there, we'll be dead, because no one's ever come back and told us that that's what happens. It's all anecdotal.
I think you should go and look at the University of Edinburgh report. Amy, thank you.
I'll look at that, you look at the public perception.
I'll do that.
Okay, thank you. Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener. Scottish Environment Link's written evidence raises concerns about the last-minute inclusion of pumped hydroelectric storage and the impact that had on stakeholders' ability to respond or, comment on the suitability or any potential environmental impacts they might have. I'd just be pleased to hear the panel's views on whether that is a concern and how local authority planning departments might mitigate any potential negative impacts now that this technology has been included in MPF3.
Well, I think that was a point more about the in-principle inclusion of national developments rather than it specifically being a concern about pumped storage, which might or might not be a concern when we get to the individual project level. But we were pretty disappointed, really, to see the inclusion of a couple of national developments at this very late stage. Many committee members will probably remember that last time around when we were in the process of adopting National Planning Framework 2, that late in the day the Hunterston coal-fired power station was added in quite late on, and that resulted in quite a significant controversy and a very time-consuming, controversial project proposal, which also resulted in a lengthy legal cases as well. And I think we really hoped that we would probably not go through that again this time. We would make sure that all the national developments were up front in the full consultation in the main issues report. There may well be good reasons that these national developments have been brought forward, but I think the fact that they've only been brought forward within the statutory 60-day parliamentary scrutiny period means that it's a really tight time for any concerned members of the public to get a handle on these issues. And in fact, even for some link member organisations, it's been really difficult for them to assess what the implications might be for their interests. It actually, I guess, also serves to highlight just how tight that 60-day parliamentary scrutiny period is for something which is such a significant document as this. If this is the spatial expression of government's economic strategy, which I think is how the Minister introduces it up front, it's a critically important document, and it's quite right that there's broad interest in the Parliament on it from a range of different committees, but that does make the timelines really difficult, especially when we're trying to gather views from our members and when members of the public are trying to get involved as well. So that's really our concern about it, rather than it being about any specifics to do with those national developments.
Understand. Mr MacLeod, do you have a view on how local authorities might help mitigate any potential negative environmental impacts?
Well, I think my only point on this would be that including other forms of, as many different forms of renewable energy as possible within MPF and indeed within our own plans is something that Council supports. We have a renewable energy strategy and in fact have dealt with a major pump storage scheme fairly recently. And on that, an awful lot of effort and work is put in through the planning process, as we do with all others. So I would have to say that from my role as head of planning in Highland Council, I think we've got good experience of dealing with mitigation, working with partners and working with the community to make sure these impacts are reduced.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there is a problem about process here, which is about public engagement. It was absolutely the flagship of the new Planning Act that public engagement would be early on. I've asked the civil servants about their late inclusion of this, and they said, oh, well, there was reference to it. And, I've looked back, and in the assessment of the long list of proposed national developments, hundreds of national developments. In Annex 2, proposed national developments considered unsuitable for designation, Cruachan was listed as unsuitable for designation. But if you look at the map, which you've now got before you in the parliamentary draft, it has pumped storage and in brackets Cruachan. So that's a bit of a concern when you look at the process that this has followed, because anyone who is concerned about that, and the John Muir Trust has no current concerns about this, I haven't looked at the expansion of Cruachan at all. It's about the process of bringing in a development at this late stage. As Aidan says, we've been there before. Then there's the concern that it actually says, when you read it, it can be pumped storage anywhere. Now that's quite strange, really, because actually pumped storage, there's only a few places you can put this, and the next likely one is Balmacan in Mr MacLeod's area. So it's very odd that this didn't just say Cruachan and Balmacan if you want to bring it in at this point. And I think the reason for that is because assessing pumped storage overall, that assessment in April 2013 by the government's department was slightly more supportive of that, although they said it was optimistic. They said pumped storage being included is strongly supported in spatial strategy, but there is no spatial element to this. So again, that process is quite unclear. It's not at all clear what you're buying when you put this in. The need for this has been proven, and we don't know where it is. And it's hard to understand why it doesn't just say Balmacan and Cruachan, perhaps because Cruachan was not regarded as a good development to put in. And it would seem slightly unnecessary. Again, I would think that wording in the NPF, text in the NPF saying we would support pumped storage to help with the difficulties of intermittency of renewable onshore wind. That would be perfectly reasonable steer. But bringing in a national development at this late stage, if you were people who lived in those communities who had looked at this and thought, well, it's not something we need to worry about, you might be quite concerned to suddenly discover it's become a national development. So there is an issue about including national developments which don't have some kind of definition. And the same applies to the grid. The John Muir Trust does not agree that you should put 11 major lines around Scotland more this time as one national development. If you ask what they've looked at in the strategic environment assessment, they say they haven't had much to look at, so it's very top line. But when it comes to planning, there's a presumption that this is going to happen. And on that point, again on your map, you've got a line on your map in the parliamentary draft in Dumfries and Galloway transmission, which was not in the main issues report map. Now, that might be an accident, but these sorts of things, they don't give communities confidence that this is a system, that the front loading is working. So I think there's some issues there.
Thank you. Can I ask another question, Convener? I'd just like to get the panel's views on the draft SPP's provision for onshore gas. In the earlier panel, there was some discussion around what the buffer zones were. 500 metres, you can live within 500 metres of an open cast coal mine, within 2.5 kilometres potentially of a wind farm, and there's some discussion about the Scottish Government, I think, have a group reviewing what will be an acceptable buffer zone from any unconventional gas extraction plant. Do you have any views on what an adequate buffer zone might be for unconventional gas extraction?
In terms of the generalities around unconventional gas extraction, I think Scottish Environment Link welcomes the more cautious approach that the government here has taken compared to governments elsewhere in the United Kingdom. So that's good. But we do feel that there's probably not any particular need to be positive at all at the moment, given the kind of renewables potential that there is in Scotland. So and also, looking at our wider climate change reduction targets too, it would seem to be possibly even a bit reckless to open up another fossil fuel front, which we have to kind of manage to try and get to our targets. In terms of specifics on buffer zones, we've recommended it 2 kilometres might be something suitable. I think it's interesting that there's a contrast between different types of development. So, for instance, 2.5 kilometres is recommended for wind farms, but not for unconventional gas. So it would seem like an obvious one to transfer over if buffers were going to be used. But I think Link's main position is on unconventional gas is that there's no particular benefits for Scotland at the moment, given we've got renewables obligations, given we've got our climate change target obligations to try and meet. It's only going to make things more difficult if we do start exploiting any scale unconventional gas.
I'm afraid I don't have much to add to it. Highland Council is not. All Highland Council, given that there is little potential within our area, our view has been just to seek clarity from Scottish Government on technical aspects. I've got no experience of dealing with these things, but I think things like the buffer referred to around wind farms, whilst there may be difficulties in interpretation with that, what scale are they referred to, what's a settlement, etc. I think they are useful and helpful. So if Scottish Government do take it forward, we would very much welcome it. And I know that Heads of Planning Scotland, which I'm also a chair of this year, are looking at this as a specific work stream. Okay.
The John Muir Trust hasn't got the technical ability to give you a specific answer on that, and we think there should be a National Energy Commission with independent experts on it, which would include people who are looking at the community aspect, so that these things are fed in. So I don't have a specific answer on that.
Okay, thank you. Christian Allard.
Yes, thanks very much, Commander. Just to go back into the hydroelectric pump storage capacity, and particularly being into the NF in the plan, I just wanted to have some clarification, especially from you two gentlemen. I think Ms. McDade had answered already. Do you think it should be in the plan? Okay, there's a problem of process. It came late, but are you quite delighted it's in the plan, or would you have preferred not having it at all?
I think we've probably not had time to assess it properly, to be honest, which kind of goes back to the point I was making earlier on, that although it was listed in the long list of potential national developments at an earlier stage, it wasn't one that was put forward as being likely to progress, so we just didn't focus our attention on it. So we need to look at it in a bit more detail to decide whether it was something that we would be likely to support or not.
And I'm afraid I'm going to join Eden on that. I think it hasn't been fully discussed, but I do think having the requirements for alternative renewable energy sources within our national planning framework is a very positive thing. But I think I hadn't picked up some of the points that Ms. McDade made, so I wouldn't like to comment further at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you have to remember about pumped storage is that it's very expensive, and it, in the end of the day, can only back up for a few days. So people often, with a lot of these things, you need to look at the technicalities of whether that's the best thing to do, or actually might there be an ordinary major hydro scheme somewhere else we could be doing. So if you're going to take the impact, is that the best way forward? So it's not as obvious as it would appear, because when it's been looked at in the past, the reason pumped storage hasn't come forward is because it's so expensive. And, these are issues that need looked at as well.
Thank you. Right. Yeah. Yes.
Are you finished? Yeah, it's just listening to Ms McDade's evidence, as an environmental organisation. Certainly it's my experience that the organisations that are very opposed to renewables development and onshore wind have been very pro-nuclear. You haven't suggested any solutions in terms of energy generation. Are you in the pro-nuclear camp? Is that your solution? Because you haven't come up with any solutions to our climate change challenges.
No, I think the solution we have is that we badly need a National Energy Commission looking at all kinds of energy and seeing what we would use to go forward. But actually, the Scottish Government and the MPF has the solution within it. Energy conservation, if you're going to spend public money, energy conservation and efficiency is 3 times more efficient than the cheapest generation, whether you like fossil fuel, nuclear, renewables, you name it. We'd be far better spending our public money on these kind of efficiencies. Now, that's very difficult at the moment, there's no doubt about it, because the UK Government is in charge of the subsidy system that goes through to the renewables, whereas the Scottish Government has to come up with the money for conservation. So there's a major issue there about not having a way to join up getting rational spend of public money. And one of the things we've suggested is actually if this money was taken in and out of the tax system rather than the regressive system we have at the moment, where it comes off people's bills, so the poorest are paying the most, relatively speaking. If this went in and out of the tax system, whatever country you're in, then this would be looked at much more carefully, and we'd have a much better way of reaching those greenhouse gas emissions targets. That's what we think.
I think the Scottish Government's white paper does say that these environmental costs would be picked up by the central government after Scotland becomes independent.
Is that a question?
Just a point of clarity.
Well, with respect, we're not here to get points of clarity from members of the committee. We're here to ask witnesses questions. Otherwise, we'll be here for the rest of the afternoon debating points about Scottish independence that have no relevance whatsoever to the MPF3. Right, okay, unless anybody's got any more questions, I think we will call it a day at that. Thank you very much to our witnesses for coming in to give evidence. We'll have a very short suspension. The Minister, I think, is here, so I'll be back in your seats in 2 minutes, please. Right, if we can reconvene, this is our third panel on the draft third National Planning Framework. I'd like to welcome the Minister, Derek Mackay, Minister for Local Government and Planning, who's joined by John McNerney, Chief Planner, Graham Marchbank, Principal Planner, and Chris Stark, Head of the Electricity Division at the Scottish Government. Now, I think before we get into questions, Minister, do you want to say something by way of an introductory statement?
Yes, please. Convener, for me it'll feel a bit like repetition, this being my third committee. Hopefully for you it feels like a fresh experience. The proposed National Planning Framework 3 is a spatial expression of the Government's economic strategy. It's about our ambition to create high quality places that support sustainable economic growth across the country, realising our opportunities for development and investment. It brings together our plans and strategies to provide a coherent vision of how Scotland as a place should evolve over the next 20 to 30 years. From the beginning of the process, I have been clear that I want the National Planning Framework and Scottish planning policy to focus planning on economic recovery, the transition to a low-carbon economy and sustainable economic growth. The spatial strategy set out in NPF 3 aims to achieve balanced and sustainable growth across Scotland. It plays to our strength, focusing, for example, on the role of city regions and towns in attracting investment, and it highlights where planning can help to reduce disadvantage. The vision for our future development describes Scotland as a successful, sustainable place, a low-carbon place, a natural, resilient place, and a connected place. But it's more than just a vision. The National Planning Framework will be taken forward by development plans, with decisions on development proposals making a real difference to places and communities. To help guide this, the proposed NPF 3 explains what the strategy means for our cities and our regions, towns, rural areas, coasts and islands. The committee has a particular interest in energy issues. NPF 3 is clear that we want to make Scotland a low-carbon place. Energy generation, storage and efficiency are all a major part of this. Our energy potential provides significant scope for investment, employment and growth across the country. We need to take action and plan now for the changes we expect to happen in the future. Our energy resources have a clear spatial dimension. Reflecting this, the NPF 3 identifies there will be opportunities and demand for this development. This includes energy hubs across the country, which will benefit from coordinated action to deliver development. Other areas have longer-term potential, and planning can help us to capitalise on our natural assets and achieve positive change. This is particularly the case in our coastal communities, where there are major opportunities for offshore renewable energy development. As a result, the links we have made between NPF 3 and the National Marine Plan will be crucial. I know the committee wants to explore our proposals for planning for onshore wind energy development. When we published the NPF 3 main issues report and draft SPP, we made our intention clear. We want to balance opportunities for development with the environment and quality of life for communities. In spatial terms, the proposed NPF 3 states that we do not wish to see wind farms in our national parks and national scenic areas. Since we published the draft SPP, we've taken further research on the community separation distance, and SNH has consulted on its map of core areas of wild land. We'll take these additional views into account, as well as the many responses to the draft SPP, and set out our approach to the regional and local planning for wind turbines in the finalised SPP. The committee would also like to consider other sources of energy, like onshore wind energy. Unconventional oil and gas provides an opportunity to further diversify our energy supplies. Clearly, the planning system, together with the other regulatory regimes, has a role to play in balancing this with the needs of the environment and communities. A careful approach, informed by evidence, is required. Energy storage is also essential to achieve our full potential for renewable energy. Our understanding of the role of storage is growing rapidly. In response to the consultee views that NPF 3 should do more to support storage, I have proposed giving national development status to pumped hydroelectric storage projects. There is no doubt that energy and the transition to a low-carbon economy form a central part of our national spatial strategy, and I welcome this opportunity to discuss the contribution that NPF 3 can make to these matters with the committee today.
Right, I'm sure you probably will be familiar with some of the issues that have come up in our earlier evidence sessions. A lot of them were around, as you referenced, energy policy. We looked at issues around wild land and around buffer zones and unconventional gas and a range of other issues. I wonder if I could just start off on this issue of wild land, which we've had quite a lot of evidence on. I wonder if I could ask you, first of all, if the Scottish Government agrees in principle that wild land should be protected from inappropriate development.
There is a balance to be struck between realising development opportunity and opportunities for communities and protecting the environment. I believe we can do both. We can deliver growth and greater protection at the same time. Of course, we refer to wild land. There will be different interpretations. But as it relates to turbines, there were specific concerns and specific points made around how determinations should be made in areas of perceived wild land, and that should have greater protection. You used the term, of course, development, and we're quite clear when we're talking about this. We're talking specifically in terms of the energy policy, the onshore wind energy policy, in terms of that wildland analysis, which is quite separate, of course, from a general point of view that we should never develop anything on wild land. I tell you, the Scottish Government, it's not my view of Minister that we're declaring part of the country dead to development. That would be a ridiculous proposition. Well, some people might want that, but generally that's not our support. Sustainable economic growth, sustainable development, which I think are in harmony with each other, is about realising opportunities but protecting the environment. So I think there's distinctions within that. But as to affording greater protection to areas of wild land in terms of policy as it relates to energy, then clearly we've been asked to take action, and that's what we're considering.
As a follow-up then to that point, there was reference in NPF 2 specifically to wild land. In the NPF 3 main issues report, which was published last summer, there is specific reference to wild land. There's no specific reference to wild land in NPF 3 as it stands. Is there a reason for that?
Two reasons, I suppose. First of all, some of the issues as they relate to wild land may be more appropriate in Scottish planning policy than in NPF 3. So it's not that we've changed our view on wild land necessarily, it's that some of it might fit more appropriately in Scottish planning policy as opposed to NPF 3 as a spatial expression. The second issue, because it's live and current, is the SNH consultation on their maps. So it might have seemed premature, whilst we knew that that was going on, to produce a concluded position in NPF 3 as well, when we will closely look at the outturn of that work, and that will inform our final thinking, and I'm sure your final thinking, on NPF 3 and SPP. So that would be the two reasons I would offer for not specifically.
But it's certainly possible when NPF 3 is finalised that there could be reference to wildland inserted in the same way as there was in NPF 2.
Yes, if we take a particular decision around whether we express the case around wild land, as we understand it in NPF 3 or SPP, it would feature, and if it was omitted, it because the government's completely changed its mind on the use of wild land, which it would be premature to make a final decision. The considerations that we should take into account is the responses to SPP, the responses to NPF 3, and now, of course, the responses to the SNH work on their own maps, and then we'll come to a final position.
We heard, particularly from panel 1, quite a lot of criticism around the quality of the SNH mapping exercise and of the methodology used in arriving at that. There was a bit more support for it from panel 2. What was the Scottish Government's view on that? Are you satisfied with the quality of SNH work?
Well, I'm far more satisfied with the work that's got to us to the current maps than the maps that existed before. I think they're far more credible than the maps that existed before. Why do I say that? Because I know the extent of work that's gone into it. And the fact that there's a consultation by SNH will lead, hopefully, to an even more robust position. SNH have produced a range of maps, of course, and you can apply different interpretations, different criteria, and they'll produce different maps. The maps that we chose to use in the environmental impact assessment, the supporting documents, what we felt was appropriate, and the criteria they used in the GIS survey feels more credible than the maps that were in place before. So are we content with what we've received? Yes, we are, and I look forward to the findings of their consultation.
To clarify, are you aware of, was the SNH mapping exercise, was that a desk exercise or was it a field exercise?
I think it was a desk exercise, but informed by GIS data and other samples. So I think it's desk. I don't think they went out and surveyed and sampled every part of the country. But I think it's far more robust than that which we had before. Of course, with modern technology, we're far better equipped to have such an exercise than was the case before.
Chick Brody.
Thank you. Morning, Minister. Morning, gentlemen. Minister, you said that there is no area that you'd say was dead to development. Yeah. Why doesn't the south of Scotland appear in the National Planning Framework? well, if I look at section 2, I've got Glasgow and Clyde Valley, Edinburgh and South East, Stirling, Perth, Dundee and Tayside, Aberdeen and North East, Inverness and Inner Murray Firth. Where's the south of Scotland in that?
What the particular section you're looking at talks about is the population conurbations and how they contribute and how they feature and how the NPF3 has impact on them. The reason I quite bluntly says that the south of Scotland features in the NPF3 is nobody could read this document and miss the relevance to their local community, but what the individual blocks of reports does is identifying those conurbations in those part of the country, some of the activities that are going on and how MPF3 extends to then. And
by the rural areas, it's not mentioned.
Well, part of the south of Scotland is a rural area, so I would say it's covered. I mean, if we say rural areas, we don't mean all rural areas in Scotland apart from the south of Scotland, or we would have said that. So it means all of Scotland.
Okay. If I may, just we talked a lot today about wild land and the mapping, and I still, as I say, feel it's like a bar of greasy soap. But I wonder if I might just talk briefly about offshore energy. One of the major initiatives that's currently going on in Europe, and from which we could benefit, is the Port Services Directive, by improving our ports. And there are some comments I note in the planning framework regarding some of the smaller ports. But in terms of the proposed national developments, I don't see any major focus on what can be. I mean, currently there's 26 billion euros available for port development, going to something like 500 billion over the next 10 years from Europe. Why isn't something like that, when they're critical to offshore energy, why are they not? Why are the ports not a major element?
Again, I disagree, and I would say that they are. Not only are they covered as the NRIP sites, the National Renewables Infrastructure Project sites, they're covered in the highlighted ports as national developments as well. Key ports include Kilryan, Peterhead, Stornoway, Scapa Flow and Henderson, just as some examples. And we also talk about the other opportunities right around the coast and how it connects to the main marine strategy. I think it's very supportive, but what we mustn't do is try and pretend that this is solely a transport document or indeed just a sales pitch for other
offshore energy
investment. Yes, what it does is give, at the top of the planning hierarchy, a certainty and support around individual projects. And I think it talks in very positive language about the opportunities arising from the coast, and particularly the hubs, the economic hubs, the areas of coordinated action, the NRIP sites, and the ports and harbours where there is current opportunities for growth. For example, Aberdeen.
Again, in discussions this morning, just two more questions. We discussed the issue of separation. How do we, and I've got one currently between South Ayrshire and East Ayrshire, how do we reconcile, in terms of your portfolio, differences where there might be a wind farm or an area of search which is aligned with the boundaries between two councils in terms of applying the 2.5 kilometre or indeed the 2 kilometre separation?
Reconciling all issues and conflict within the planning system would be wonderful if we were able to achieve it. Specifically on Mr Brodie's question on crossing the boundaries, when local authorities have produced areas of search, let's just say some are more credible than others and some are more up-to-date than others. Same as the development plan process, ideally they should all be less than 5 years old. Irrespective of the areas of search, every application should be determined on its merits with the material considerations in the case. So everything would still be looked through the prism of all factors to be taken into account in any individual application. But the areas of search, I can think of the member's own area. We've had an interest in Ayrshire. I've met with planners, with yourself, in that part of the country, and the local authorities there take a slightly different approach. Indeed, they have a different view, and to varying degrees, about how much they see it as an economic opportunity and how much they feel constrained by it. But where you have authority boundaries touching each other, what the spatial framework should do is take account of that and in any application, as I say, you consider all local factors such as cumulative impact. So just because an area of search or development or individual site was juxtapositioned to another one wouldn't present any problems to the planning system. But do I have concerns about the credibility of some areas of search? Yes, I do.
One last question, if I may. Given we've had a challenge with the coal situation, particularly in East Ayrshire, and I managed to get my hands on a map of the mines and the mine shafts, which are considerable and stretch even into the Minister's own area. I just wondered, in terms of developing district heating networks across the country, what plans there are in terms of using the huge heat sources that we have in areas like that, which can mitigate and produce low-carbon heat for communities, not just in East Ayrshire, South Ayrshire, North Ayrshire, Renfrewshire, and I just wonder what discussions there have been or are likely to be to promote this fairly significant source of energy.
In the MPF3 action plan on point 11, page 46, it states that, first of all, we give greater planning support to heat maps, and that is a form of energy use, of course, very environmentally friendly because it's the way it's produced. But we'll publish a heat map and then require local authorities to produce heat maps for their own local authority areas as well. So we'll take action in addition to strengthening the support and planning policy, which is an emerging area like storage emerging compared to the position it had under previous planning policies. And then specifically on your question on coal restoration, of course, it is a very difficult issue, but I was reassured by some of the headline conclusions from the finding that the previous Chief Planner Jim McKinnon found when he stated that the policy framework at national level for open cast coal mining was clear and comprehensive. And that's not to say it can't be improved. That's why Mr Ewing's undertaken the consultation that he has, and that will then inform planning policy, which I think we improve in the current iteration as well. But I think there are very significant issues around local authority monitoring that we will carry forward. But I'm not complacent just because the review found that planning policy was quite robust. Room for improvement. We have improved it. We'll look very closely at the findings. But like Mr Brody, I've visited the sites, and very substantial sites requiring substantial restoration, and major concerns around much of that, and the failures around some of that. But the question is more what was monitored and enforced, as opposed to was the planning regime and planning policies right. So proactivity on planning and more action on heat maps and production in planning policy. Of course, like many of these proposals, they will be private sector, not just public sector led, and so we will rely on the private sector to take a number of these forward to conclusion. But what they will have is some certainty within the planning system that we're supportive.
Yeah, two members want to ask supplementary. Start with Hans Malik.
And thank you. Good morning and welcome, Minister. Chick Brody actually made a point about the possibility of resources for development or improving of ports. Is there any ports destined for closure? Whilst we're looking at improving what we already have, are there any ports that are destined to be closed?
It wouldn't really be appropriate for me to comment, not that I'm aware of in any event, so I don't, I'm not quite sure what Mr Malik's referring to, but not that I'm aware of. What we're saying is there are immense opportunities, and MPF3 and planning policies should support that. And sometimes some of the demands are in conflict. Let's say where there's a leisure or a recreational demand for a coastal use, and then others maybe want something more industrial. So sometimes there can be conflict within that demand, but no, it's not seen as a negative. It's very much seen as a positive, and the requests we've had have been to expand the use of many of the ports and harbours. So there's no negatives.
I was just wondering whether there was any scheme or any rationalisation being considered for our ports around our shores to try and see, how we can develop the ones that would be left.
In some parts of the country, there's already national ownership. I suppose an example that springs to mind is around Shetland. And in some of the other sites, government's been very proactive with our partners such as Scottish Enterprise, the NRIP sites, the National Renewables Infrastructure Project sites, to try and support development. And that's a mixture of public and private partnership. But most of the ports and harbours in Scotland are privately owned, of course.
They still form the structure of a national grid of ports around.
Of course they do. And almost in a sense, the national planning framework is almost, it doesn't take cognizance of ownership sometimes. It's what's in the national interest rather than whether it should be in public hands or not. That's secondary to the planning system.
You're not aware of any ports that may be destined for closure?
No, I'm not.
I think we're slightly in danger of straying into the territory of another committee, Infrastructure Committee.
Chair, the reason why I asked was because if there's resources available for development of ports, if there were ports destined to be closed as well, we could have looked at a more rational logistic framework.
I'm delighted to say, and this is, I suppose, an ideal position for a politician, when it comes to national planning framework and SPP, it's normally about developments happening rather than shutting things down, so I'm delighted to come to committee on that basis. It's about consenting rather than closing.
Okay.
Not as the case may be.
Joan McCall.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Minister. Good afternoon, rather. My supplementary concerned the issue of community separation distance, and I know that there are very polarised views that have come out on that in the consultation you undertook, and you've commissioned the University of Dundee to do some research which will help inform the final SPP. I was very concerned to hear from the industry representatives who took evidence from this morning that the Whiteley and Blacklaw developments would have breached the 2.5 kilometre boundary that was proposed. And I just wondered whether that was something that would concern you as well, given the importance of those developments.
I think it helps me make a point, first of all, that, of course, planning policies in this sense won't be retrospective. It will be everything coming forward. So I suppose someone on the other side might make the point, well, you know, that was before, it won't prejudice any up. It won't undo the past in the scale of Whiteley's. Incidentally, I think we've got much to be proud of, that we've got one of the largest wind farms in Western Europe in Scotland. I think that's a good thing, not to prejudice any future applications. But on this subject, some have said we've gone too far, and others have said we've not gone far enough. So either I've got the balance completely right or completely wrong. Actually, I don't think it's either. In fairness, I think it's far more subtle than that. Because whatever we do on planning, we want it to be based on evidence, where we have that evidence. And then after that, each application should still be considered in its merits, unless there's a national overriding reason to take a position that we have. So, for example, in Group 1, in the current planning position that we suggest in our position statement in earlier documents, we talk about where we don't want wind farms to be constructed in the national parks and the areas of national scenic interest. So that's setting a national parameter, that's setting a position here. For others, I think we can be more subtle and take into account the circumstances in each case. And that's why I would come back to the separation distance. That what we found, if you look at the panoply of policies that we were proposing, I went to the Western Isles, for example, who have great aspirations around energy and how it feeds into community development, sustaining population and so on. And I have had requests from that area to say, please allow us to build turbines in this area, which is not always the case, I have to say, but certainly the planning authority there expressed to me by showing me maps what the policies meant very, very few areas that could be developed, even when there was demand to develop it. So it felt disproportionate, and it felt as if national policies were strangling local decision-making and local opinion necessarily. So that's why I will go back to the considerations that I will undertake based on evidence, based on the research, and what will work for local circumstances as well. So we felt that extending the 2K in consultation to the 2.5K would give a bit greater certainty, would take account of the increasing height of turbines and other factors, and then the evidence suggests, well, it doesn't do that because it doesn't take into account the individual characteristics of the landscape. So I'm looking again at how we can achieve a separation distance that can inspire confidence but can be appropriate to local circumstances but not be set in an arbitrary way. Now, I apologise to the committee, I don't come to you today with a definitive position on this or some other matters, but you will appreciate that would mean me short-circuiting the other consultations and not take your views into account either. But of course, your findings will help inform that. So we haven't taken a final position on separation distance. The aspiration was to reflect circumstances, to give greater certainty, because for some visual impact of a turbine is crucial and central, and so I think that should be part of the planning process. But whether it appears as area of search or in a group category or strengthened and developed management remains to be decided. So sorry going on about length for that, but there's a number of things to be considered, and I've tried to explain my current thinking.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, I think Mike McKenzie has got a question in the same area.
Yes, thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, Minister. I mean, really this kind of follows on in the same area, because from the evidence that we've heard this morning and a lot of the written evidence, this is an area that seems to be fraught with uncertainty and misunderstanding. I appreciate, despite your best efforts so far, and I just wondered that you know, there seems to be uncertainty over the SNH wildland maps, whether they represent an absolute prohibition of development, whether they represent guidance. The separation area that John McAlpine referred to, there seems to be uncertainty about whether that refers to separation from settlements or individual houses, and how do you define a settlement? I appreciate there are difficulties. Crofting Township looks quite different to maybe a village in another part of the country, and also whether that separation refers to a kind of separation of wind farms as opposed to individual turbines. And so there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and we almost heard a kind of plea, I think, earlier on from the planning officer from Highland, the head of planning from Highland Council. He's the poor guy that's stuck in the middle of this uncertainty. What can you do to perhaps improve the situation with regard to creating clarity and certainty for all concerned?
That's a good set of questions, Mr McKenzie, and I look forward to the committee's findings on all of it. Incidentally, Mr MacLeod, Head of Planning in Highland Council, a very well-paid guy, so he's well paid to do his job, and a very senior planner. And he helpfully makes the point that the planning system is sometimes about conflict. It's about making choices and priorities and balancing up the demands and the material considerations that you have. And that's why it is so difficult sometimes for the centre to create a raft of policies that will always get it right. Now, some things we should do, setting out parameters and setting out the position of government in the country and the Parliament. And then, in many ways, the best determinations are those left to those at the most local level who can apply the policies as appropriate and in a really proportionate way. The reason we've tried to adopt some of the positions that we proposed was to have greater consistency across the country, frankly, and to respond to some of the concerns that had been raised. For example, the ban on wind farms in national parks might not seem new, but it's certainly clearer than was the case before. And in terms of the national scenic areas, it actually refers back to an earlier question on development. Development can actually happen in the most protected parts of Scotland, a nature site, but as long as you can evidence how you mitigate any environmental impact. And so the planning system must be sensitive to those environmental circumstances. So what we'll try and achieve by the end of this process is a degree of spatial clarity through MPF3 in, as I say, the various government strategies, position clarity in SPP, and then clearly new guidance will have to come from all of this, because we'll have a new set of policies and planners will want, from head of planning to caseworkers, clarity on what it all means. But I will not have, even with the wisdom of Solomon, the magic formula that gives a clear answer on any individual case, but we can certainly have clarity on the parameters we set and the national policy on what we're trying to achieve. But it will not, Mr McKenzie, wipe away the conflict that exists in local areas where some folk want wind farms and some folk don't.
Thank you very much. That's very useful.
Thank you. Alison Johnson.
Thank you. Sort of carrying on the same issue. Separation isn't obviously always about wind farms. We've heard from a representative from onshore gas this morning, and we've had a bit of discussion about different buffer zones for different types of energy production. Is it your ambition at the end of the day that you will have specific buffer zones for specific sorts of development, or are you going to look at every single decision on its merits? You know, Mr. Cronin suggested earlier that it might be possible to have an onshore gas installation within 500 metres of a domestic property, depending on the geography of the area. And is it the government's intention to look at every single application on its merits, or are you going to produce guidance that says an open cast coal mine must not be within 500 metres of a domestic property and an onshore wind farm must not be within 2.5 kilometres off a domestic settlement?
I think for some particularly controversial areas, we'll need a degree of clarity. For example, onshore wind, or for other areas, there will have to be a buffer zone. Generally speaking, although those parameters would be set, it will be the case, though, that planners can still determine on the individual circumstances of the case that which is appropriate to the development. And the reason for that is if the landscape's not exactly the same in two different areas, why would you make the policy exactly the same? So it'll be appropriate for some types of development, yes, but not others. And I take the view that the planning system generally should be proportionate and locally sensitive. And it would be wrong sometimes to create arbitrary formulas on what we think should apply across the country in local circumstances. But in every single case, local circumstances should be taken into account, and the environmental protections that should be there, and the consideration of impact on local communities and the settlements should always be taken into account. But we don't propose a hierarchy or a formula of define the development, define the community, and then set the separation distance for every type of development. To answer your question, no, we don't propose that.
That's very helpful. Can I ask another question on the issue of pumped hydroelectric storage? The first panel we heard from this morning, the energy interests, they felt that perhaps no location was mentioned specifically in MPF3 in order to provide flexibility for what might come afterwards. But there were concerns from the panel before yourselves, from Environment Link in particular, and from the John Muir Trust, about the lack of time. They'd raised concerns about the last-minute inclusion in MPF3 of pumped hydroelectric storage. And it is surprising because you yourself said to the committee this morning that, you know, and I agree entirely, that storage is essential to achieve our energy potential. So I'm just wondering why this wasn't in the MPF3 earlier, to allay the concerns those groups have, given its national importance.
I would say to Ms Jones, maybe it has come as a surprise, but nobody's perfect. We didn't get it 100% right first time, but we recognise that both in the digital infrastructure and in the capacity for Storage Scotland as part of the energy mix, yes, there were opportunities there that did meet the national criteria, and we believe that it would add value. Both projects are very exciting, and I don't think, I could be wrong, could be proven to be wrong, but I don't think they'll be as controversial as the last additions to NPF do. I think they'll actually find a great deal of support because of what they can do to those sectors. In terms of process, which was your substantive point, ideally it would be better if they were in the original consultation document, the proposals, the main issues report. But isn't it a good thing that we're able to show how we've listened to bids, we've listened to those engaging with the system, and we've changed, and we've done it in a very transparent and public way? Because when I set out the participation statement to Parliament, which Parliament through its committee system supported, we did say that some projects might not make it to the final stage, and we did say that we might add some, and we've added some, and we've got the criteria for how we've done it. So I understand the concern about the lateness of it, but I think the 60 days intensive analysis by committee and then the further engagement we'll undertake, bear in mind this is not concluded until the summertime, gives us time to get it right. And extending this to SPP, there are areas where I've had to refine policy and go out and consult further because I wasn't sure we got it right. One will be undertaken in telecommunications. SNH went out on the maps in areas of core wild land, and I did a specific consultation on sustainable economic growth and sustainable development. Why? Because the views coming back from the consultation, I think, suggested more work required to be done, and we've done it. So I think we've shown we're adept, and we have updated in line with circumstances. And if people rail against these proposals, then I would take that into account, but I can't see it.
Just to go further on that point, absolutely, the substantive point is about the process, not about the development. And absolutely none of us are perfect. I think, though, Environment Link, RSPB, in response to the committee this morning, said it made it very difficult for them to engage with their wider membership, to sort of gather any concerns that there might be, and there might be none. So I'm just wondering if the answer would be to enable the process to be as responsive both ways as possible, to lengthen the parliamentary scrutiny period so that some organisations aren't disadvantaged by that tight 60 days.
I would actually commend some of the environmental organisations that don't generally seem to be slow to me in making their views known or sharing their opinions with their very sizeable membership in Scotland, and I mean that as a compliment. But I'm convinced through the engagement of the local authorities, planning authorities, stakeholders, developments, the work with 4 parliamentary committees, the exposure that we've had. I even visited the poor suffering shoppers in a shopping centre in Edinburgh with National Planning Framework 3. They were out for their shopping and they got a dose of MPF free. So they were hit randomly with consultation on the planning system, to their surprise. But I think the level of engagement's been substantial. Now, I suppose your point is, but yes, that development wasn't in detail there, but the references around the energy mix was. So I suppose this is an evolution from that it's drawn out a specific time, a type of energy, and how we think it can add, how it adds value to have it in MPF free. If Parliament is so opposed to it, if the public were so opposed to it, then I'm sure that would feature in the next 60 days, and I'd be in some difficulty to sustain its retention as a national project, but I suspect that won't be the case. My position would be more vulnerable if it was a particularly negative or controversial application in terms of storage. I don't believe it is. And in terms of digital fibre, it's about moving Scotland forward. So, again, I can't see any great difficulty in doing that. Preparation for committee, I had to look at more than just pumped hydro, of course, and familiarise myself with other forms of energy storage, and some of that might be a bit more controversial and require a greater explanation, such as the use of supercapacitators or flywheels, which I wasn't familiar with before preparation for this morning's committee. But on pumped hydro, I think there'll be a great deal of support.
I mean, as I said, it's not about pumped hydro. It was the process question, really. And thank you.
Just on this question of the process, can I just follow this up? Because, as Alison Johnson said, there's 60 days for Parliament to scrutinise MPF process. We've already talked about, in relation to timings, the fact that the SNH have got their core areas mapped, which they're consulting on again, and there's SPP in draft form going on in the background too. I mean, how does all tie together in terms of the dates this will all be finalised, and how does that fit in with the opportunity for proper parliamentary scrutiny?
And Mr Fraser, you know that I wouldn't want to be churlish, but you never had it so good. Never before has SPP been consulted upon at the same time as MPF free, as I understand it. So actually consulting on both together, and then when we knew there further consultation was required on specific areas, we've done that, but we've done it within the wider envelope, the wider timescale of the whole process. So what I propose is, after Parliament's scrutinised, the other consultations are ongoing, we'll inform the work. We've published a statement on SPP, Scottish Planning Policy, a position statement where we are with that. The other work streams have to be concluded, but I think over the next few months, once Parliament's finalise its thinking on MPF free, I will have finalised our thinking on SPP, and we'll conclude both together by June this year.
By June, right. So Parliament will have a chance to vote on MPF 3 in the knowledge these other consultations have been concluded and your decisions have been taken on them.
Yes. Right. Now, what we may want to consider is how that process is aligned. Frankly, we might require further thinking on that, because clearly what you're considering is MPF free, but obviously I ask more than that, go into SPP as other committees have done, and I'll give some further thinking about how that's shared at the same time. Yeah.
Before we run around doing high fives, I think it's great that we've got some consolidation and merging. I wonder if we can just go back to the issue of wild land. Last year we were told of delays to the mapping of wild land by SNH and when it would be delivered. And today we heard from people who should be at least participating in some way that it is our view, a quote from SSE's comment, that the SNH mapping exercise could have been more effectively conducted. It needs a more scientifically robust mapping exercise, the assessment of range of threats to wildland, a fair and equitable management regime to address those threats. I fail to understand why, when the original report was delayed, that we haven't got something that participants don't feel is robust. What penalty is probably a strong word, but but I'll use it. What penalties does the Minister apply to organisations who don't achieve the established planned outcome?
If an agency that was answerable and accountable to the Scottish Government wasn't delivering on its outcomes, then clearly there'd be repercussions. But you would look at something more just than one issue in isolation. And for that reason, last time I met all the key agencies, the focus of my work was on performance of the planning system, on meeting the government's objectives and ensuring that the planning system was effective and they were meeting their targets within that. And when it came to, for example, timescales on engaging in individual planning applications, they were. So I would look at their performance much more widely than one specific issue, as you've expressed it on SNH. But I can't help but reflect, you have quoted one source who has an interest in the outcome of that piece of work as well. Maybe SSE would produce a completely different map in their interpretation of wildland, as any of us could.
We had the evidence last year that they didn't achieve the planned date of the mapping that they were, and it wasn't just by weeks. It was a substantial miss.
Mr Brodie, I would suggest you direct that question, as I'm sure you have already done, to SNH. But what I would say, what I require for the purpose of this policy to be robust is whatever they produce to be credible, to be well informed and to be scientific, and I've got every reason to believe that it is. And
on time.
Well, it will be on time for June this year. You can bet your bottom dollar that's going to be the case, because clearly can't deliver a planning policy without it. But that which we have now is better than what we had before, and for my purposes it will be on time, and it will be all those other things as well. And if it's not, you bet the dancer for it.
Well, I should just point out, Minister, when we did intend to invite SNH to come along and give evidence to us, but we were assured by your office that was unnecessary, as you would answer all the questions relating to their remit.
I think I'm doing okay, but I'll keep going on SNH.
Okay, thank you. Right. Okay, I should have said at the start of this panel, I'd like to welcome John Pentland, who's joining us as an additional member today. John, I think you've got a question you want to ask.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Convener, for the opportunity to speak. And the Minister, did mention repetition, so it will come as no surprise to the Minister that I want to speak with reference to Europe's largest brownfield site. Now, I welcomed, as my constituents did in Mullinwisher, that Ravenscraig's prominence within the draft NPF3. And now, following discussion with North Lanarkshire Council, I would like to suggest that this be augmented in line with the Council's submission to this committee, and I would be grateful for the Minister's view on this. Now, I'm not sure if the Minister has seen or is aware of the Council's submission, but their proposal would build on the existing planning status of the site, and specifically the important regional and national role of the town centre, as referred to in the description in the NPF3 main issues report, which defined the development as including new homes, a town centre, transport facilities, community facilities and business industrial development. And I agree with the Council that this reflects very well the type and scale of the development envisaged for the site, and therefore the document's description of Ravenscraig should be amended to more accurately reflect the dual status of the site as a new community and a centre of regional and national significance.
In a very straightforward way, I have seen the evidence, and I know that North Lanarkshire Council, just like the member, who have both lobbied hard for Ravenscraig to be included as a national development. Certainly welcome that status, and if you think we can do something around wording to reflect the development there more accurately or in an even more positive fashion, then certainly look at that, because the substantive point is that we're affording it national development status because we believe it met the criteria. So if there's further refinement we can do around wording to further support that, then I'm happy to look at that, Mr. Pentland. I don't think it changes the position in the document.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Christian Allard.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Minister. As opposed to Mr. Brodie, I'll have to point out that I'm quite delighted as a North East MSP to see Dundee, Peterhead and Aberdeen all there in the proposed national developments, and of course Cairngorm Park is as well in the North East region, and I'm delighted with the protection you will have from now on. But my question is on the CCS, and particularly you decided to amalgamate the Grangemouth and Peterhead CCS as opposed to the main issues reports where they were separated, and I don't have any explanation why that happened.
I don't think there's any particular reason, because we identify that both have opportunities, both have status, but it will be dependent on, I think in this instance, DEC in terms of where investment are going. There's a private sector issue as well. So we're supportive of carbon capture and storage. Both are referenced in an MPF3, so I would be surprised to learn that there was any concern about any dilution in that, because they're both referenced and both have our support. So at what pace they go is in the hands of others, not Scottish Government.
Okay, thank you for your answer. If I may add another question. We heard a lot about the unconventional gas this morning, and I would like to know about your independent expert scientific panel. Who is on it, and when are they supposed to come back to us?
Okay, Graham.
Yeah, the scientific panel comprises a number of academics. I can get a list for the committee if that would help. I met them a couple of weeks ago to give them a presentation on planning. They haven't set a date for their final report. That's the information I have at the moment.
So we've no date at this time, but yet is under NPF3. So how do you think we can incorporate all these findings?
Sure. Based on what we have at the moment, of course, there's a number of different organisations involved in the process should there be further exploration of unconventional gas. And if you take the example of fracking, there are no applications, as I understand it, at this point in time for fracking in Scotland. But if there were, there would be an interest from the Health and Safety Executive, from SEPA in terms of watercourse and so on. Licences, of course, is a reserved matter. In terms of the planning process, it would be relatively new, but we've set out in our proposed policies and Scottish planning policy the kind of things that we need to be considered, such as protection for the environment, quite a stringent position around protection of the environment. And all that would have to be considered if an application was to be received. Now, fracking, of course, is the most controversial end of that debate. For any current applications, they would be considered under current policy, which already asks about mitigation, environmental impact, community interest and so on. But what the expert panel will be able to do is advise us on emergent thinking and how we can ensure we've got the right balance. So we're looking very closely as to what's happening south of the border, as well as having the expert panel. And as soon as we've got the report, I'm of course happy to share it with the committee. But this opportunity has allowed us to update policy in light of circumstances and say a bit more about unconventional gas than we did under the previous suite of policies.
John McCaffrey's got questions in the same area.
Yes, well, I actually had a supplementary to Mr. Pentland's question, but also wanted to ask about unconventionals.
Well,
can I ask for right? Okay. First thing is, obviously, congratulations to Mr. Pentland and getting Ravenscraig included. And Mr. Allard just talked about his 3 developments, which cause him great delight in the North East. I submitted my proposals to the consultation on this and suggested that the South West of Scotland should have at least one national development. And I propose either the A75 or the Crichton campus, which is a potential economic generator for the South West. Not a single project from the South West has made it in, and as Mr. Brodie already raised, because we don't have a major city in the south, it's also been left out of that aspect of the plan with the city regions. And I just wondered, like if you can understand the disappointment in our region at that, and how we can address that disappointment.
I don't think, first of all, I wouldn't take it personally.
Dumfries and Galloway Chamber of Commerce and the Council, I believe, put in similar submissions.
Then I would be able to make the point that this essentially is a planning document at the top of the planning hierarchy, and you could not possibly read it and think that it didn't impact in the southwest of Scotland, and the same for Scottish planning policy. I mean, one of the significant changes, I think, is greater support for our town centres and rural areas, and try and give them a future from and give them sustainable economic growth. So I think that represents absolutely every part of the country. And when we looked at the national developments, we didn't have as a criteria that we had to hit every county, every local authority area or every region, but I have asked for and ensured that we had a breakdown of what it meant for individual local authorities. So there might not be a national designation, but it does impact on every single local authority in Scotland. If you take one of the national developments, the walking and cycling route, then that will extend to the south west of Scotland, the south of Scotland as well. So again, that's why I'm saying it's wrong to suggest that the national developments don't touch upon every part of the country, or that MPF 3 doesn't touch upon every part of the country. Where there are individual development proposals, such as at the Crichton campus, which I have also visited, or the particular road infrastructure project, they may already exist in government infrastructure spending plans or other areas. So just because they're admitted from here doesn't mean they're not important, or government doesn't support them, or they're not happening. It's just, does this status attach a value that assists them with planning? And they've all been assessed on the same criteria. So I hope that that gives further reassurance, having failed to reassure Mr. Brodie that that was the case. But I do think every part of the country is covered. And just having talked long enough to give myself the time to get the right page, in terms of the borders, for example, Gala Shields is included in the section as a connected town, and when we talk about the Edinburgh City region, it goes wider than that as well. So I just make the point that sometimes the headline, when you look into the detail behind it, is far more reassuring. I have, of course, tried to keep the document pretty concise as well. I mean, it could have been much bigger. This, incidentally, is only some of the consultation maps that help involve it, but I'm much happier the documents ended up that size rather than that size. It might seem like a flippant point, but something that's clear and concise and not too exhaustive is better than having to mention everything just for the hell of it. I think it's been far more pointed than that. And I think that people in every part of Scotland can use it to get certainty within the planning system, but also as a very positive document about our aspirations for the entire country. But you can't look at it in isolation. On your other points...
points in unconventionals?
Well, just before we leave the South of Scotland pork barrel, I'll bring in Mr. Brodie again.
Yes, thank you, Minister. I hear what you say, that, and indeed the document does add to opportunities across Scotland. However, it's not the comment about the South of Scotland within the document isn't just the document itself. If I look at, as I have done, employment statistics, Scottish enterprise involvement, business gateway involvement, everything else like that, and I relate that to the propensity to have a large number of wind farms, notwithstanding Highlands and Islands, which creates some lack of cohesion among communities. It does seem to me that there is a lack of attention. I would have thought that this document might have looked at the A75, or indeed the extension, given what will happen on September 19th, give this the extension of the Waverley line to Carlisle, for example, to open up all of the opportunities that we have both in tourism and exports and what have you. And I just don't, I just do not understand. It does appear that perhaps even a paragraph might have helped us understand what the overall aspirations are.
I wouldn't judge a member by the size of their paragraph, I have to say, but when it comes down to the Dumfries and Galloway area, Dumfries is highlighted as a key rural town. There's other examples in here, but you pick specifically on transport and the road networks. You see, if there was a rail connection, a kind of basic rail connection, of course it would require an Act of Parliament as a different consenting regime. But a lot of the road network is not in this. It's just referenced as it's good to have a connected place, but we don't feel the need to attach specific planning status to it, because upgrading the road might not require planning status. So just bear in mind, this is not the sum total of the government's ambitions. We've got other documents for that, many other documents for that. This is the top of the planning hierarchy for the planning system, and that spatial expression of what we think it needs to be achieved. And I would say again, for the final document, we'll look again at making sure every part of the country feels included, but it has to be on a proper methodical basis, not just that someone feels we missed a bit, when actually the analysis shows that even under the headline it does touch every part of the country, and in the area that the members represent so well is covered, okay, not always by a national designation, but certainly referenced within the full MPF 3, and I've got further examples of how that would be the case, which I've referenced earlier, such as the NRIP sites, town centres, Stranraer regeneration, and the walking and cycling network that covers the whole country. So I hope that further assists the member.
John McCall.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Minister. One thing that we are getting or might get in the South West is unconventional coal bed methane extraction, which has already been given planning permission in Canonbay. You answered a question about this earlier and explained that you didn't think it was helpful to put a measurement on the buffer zone that you announced last year. However, we have put a measurement, albeit your earlier comments, we have put a measurement on wind farm boundaries. So I just wondered why a measurement for wind farm boundaries was okay, but not unconventionals.
Back to Alison Johnson's point, the question I was asked is would we have specific separation distance for different range of developments, and generally the point there was no, but there would be some that are controversial where that's required. So we've discussed wind and we've discussed unconventional gas. Now what we believe is that there's got to be some sort of buffer environmental protection. Exactly what that is would depend on the circumstances, and we'll have further advice from that when the external panel concludes its remarks. So it is one of the areas where it's possible we have a distance, but unlike most other applications, but generally speaking, that I think there needs to be some sort of separation and some sort of natural buffer from development to communities. Exactly what that distance is, well, that remains to be determined.
The difference between wind farms and unconventionals is that unconventionals can be in the heart of communities, you know, as Mr Cronin said in his evidence this morning, is somewhere in England that's 500 metres from a housing estate. He also went on to say that the water that's extracted in terms of shale gas is radioactive and requires treatment. And so I would be very concerned if wind farms had more stringent planning guidelines than something that produces radioactive water.
Well, of course, it wouldn't, because my earlier answer covered there's at least 4 different agencies involved for licensing, for water protection through SEPA, for health and safety executive for some of the equipment, of course, for the planning system. So I think we've got a pretty rigid framework at the moment, and we'll continue to look at that and the evidence that's produced. And I think it's really important on this that we take a very cautious approach, but whatever we do is based on the evidence.
I was a wee bit concerned in your opening statement. You seemed quite positive about unconventionals, the language that you used, but as you've said, subsequently it's been looked into by this scientific panel. And also, you know, in central Scotland, the proposals are being examined by the independent reporter. So do you think maybe we should, before we take a position on unconventionals, we should wait for the results of both those inquiries?
Yes, so I've just double-checked my exact wording to say a careful approach informed by evidence is required. And I would go back to that to say that there are safeguards within the planning system at the moment, but as further developments come, and I picked on fracking as an example because there are no live applications, some might emerge, and we'll need more information to assist planners making any decision around fracking, because it will be relatively new if it was presented to Scotland. So yes, we should take quite a cautious approach, and I think that the waiting and the planning system does that at the moment.
I personally would disagree with that, because in my area, as I've already raised with you, you know, that permission was given for one form of methodology and the company then changed to a different form of methodology. The other point I would want to make, I mean, you've said on several occasions that fracking isn't proposed in Scotland, but research in Australia shows that 40% of coal bed methane developments end up being fracked. Were you aware of that?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Right. So therefore, you would have to, really should have to submit fresh planning applications, shouldn't you, if you were going to frack?
If there's we have to be very careful though in the wider policy, because of course planning is about land use. It's essentially what's happening largely above the ground in the structures. So in all energy policy, it have to be considered in the round and go beyond just the planning system. And that's why I make the point that the permission given for land use is quite different from some of the licences that's given for a particular type of extraction. And if that changes, then I would be very interested in understanding the details, what that meant for planning or what that meant for other licences. But what will ensure is it doesn't fall between the cracks in terms of policy support, and that's why the expert group will be so helpful. But I'm here to answer for the planning policies and the safeguards that builds in. Questions of enforcement, of course, would be for the local authority or SEPA if it's down to contamination or environmental impact, or for DEC, I believe, when it comes to the energy licences and enforcement and the amendments such as you've described. Yeah.
Okay. If nobody has any more questions, I think we can call it a day at that. Thank you, Minister, for coming along, and thank you to your officials for answering our questions. It's been very helpful to us. We're now going to private session, and we'll have a short suspension first.